I want to welcome you to the Retro Rogues Live Show. Please pay attention to our warning graphic. It states that the Retro Rogues Live Show is intended for an adult audience and not intended for children under the age of 13. Parental discretion is advised. And yes, my cam is actually on tonight. I don't know how much it'll be on tonight, but I shaved and I managed to get a haircut finally, despite all the insanity that is going on in the world. So I feel slightly more human. For those of you who are not aware, my name is Dave Beatty, and I am one of your hosts. For nearly the last 30 years, I've been a professional illustrator and graphic designer. Worked on a lot of fun things that some people have heard of, such things as Justice League of America, Batman Incorporated, and Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes. But enough about that. I want to introduce my co-host. This is Mr. Eric Alexander. Eric, please tell the folks hopefully watching or listening at home some of the fun things that you have worked on as a creative professional.
Well, I didn't get a haircut, obviously. My hair is pretty long, but I am going to kind of be on camera at least a little bit during our segments. But I am Eric Alexander, also known as Bass God 14. That's Bass God 14, not Bass God 14. That's Bass God like a bass guitar. And I am obviously the co-host of the Retro Rogues Live. I am also the chief financial officer of Bad Bob Productions. And I did want to kind of give a little bit of an update about some of the projects that I've been working on recently with Bad Bob. So the first thing I wanted to show you folks is our logo. I don't think I've actually shown it on the air before. That is Bad Bob. That is sort of the mascot for my film company, which is located in Arizona. A small film company, but that is actually Bad Bob himself. That is our logo. And I'm happy to announce that a film that I've been working on for the last couple of months now, actually ever since the first shelter-in-place order started to come out, is actually very near completion. It's currently out with the editor. I got to see a first sort of rundown of the intro, which I'm very excited about. And I'm very hopeful that the film will be complete sometime next month. So fingers crossed, hopefully it gets done even earlier than that. Obviously, the editor's going to have to give us a rough cut, and then we're going to have to decide whether we want it or not. It's probably going to be about 10 minutes. That's what I'm thinking. The script was around 13 pages, and usually it's a minute per script, but our script format wasn't exactly the tightest film, film script format. We kind of threw it together a little bit, but I'm hopeful, that the final results are going to be presentable and folks are going to enjoy it. So I'll definitely be talking about that more in the coming weeks.
Very cool. Congratulations. That's exciting news. So
yeah, I'm pretty stoked about it. And I had to kind of get approval from my partner to make sure that this could officially be a Bad Bob, a Bad Bob production. Bad Bob is actually an LLC, so it's actually, I do have a partner with it, so I have to make sure that he has approval. Obviously, if I want to make a film on my own, I can. If I want to go with my buds, I can make one. But in order to make it sort of official and part of the production, I had to get that approval from my partner.
Well, very cool. Very cool. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I haven't heard much about it beyond the fact that you've been working on it. So
I'll tell you right now, Dave, I think it could be a great comic book. And maybe once you see it, I'll pitch it to you. My idea, what I have about making it into at least a one-shot that I think would be a really good tie-in, because this is definitely like very low budget. The whole point of this film actually was to do something with shelter in place. So the actors never got to interact with each other. It's very much like Wrath of Khan, right? Famously, Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, William Shatner and Ricardo Montalban never actually got to interact.
Right.
That's a famous story and also a really cool story, because, watching it, it's like, that's hard to believe that they never actually got to interact, and they never did. So this entire film project was done that way. None of the actors got to interact with each other at all. I was the one running lines with them. So that was also an interesting part of this experience. But hopefully it comes out well. Like I said, it is experimental. But I think the premise, kind of like Occupants, when we did Occupants, I think had so much more potential than just the film, because obviously the film was limited by budget. That was a very low budget film. So it's found footage and all that stuff. And, with the Occupants comic book, we really took that premise and expanded it. Well, this premise can be expanded too, Dave. So once you get a look at it, I'll be curious to see what you think, and I'm going to definitely pitch something to you.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Awesome. That's cool news. Are we okay to go ahead and go to our first? We're going to start off with a little bit of a news item here at the top of the
We do have a
show.
comment. We do have a comment, Dave.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Before we move on to that, Bobby's in the house. Bobby, we're always glad to have you around. And you said best of luck. Sounds great. Very cool. You were able to pull that off. And Bobby, I hope I pulled it off. We'll see when it's actually put together and edited. I mean, I've seen all the footage. I was there to record it and all that kind of stuff. In fact, I use StreamYard to record it, by the way. So the very same thing that I use to make this show, to produce this show, that's what I used to film this movie, all the live action part of this movie. So, and yes, Bobby, it was challenging. He said it's challenging. I'm sure it was challenging, especially since I don't have a lot of experience doing that. Like I said, I don't have the sort of the skill set or the experience that they had for Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. But they did it very well. They really did a great job on that with, two amazing actors that never got to interact with each other. And that's the basic premise of doing a film with a shelter in place.
Very cool. Yeah. I'm excited to see it. So, and I can only begin to imagine how challenging. I mean, it's difficult enough to put something together when people can actually interact with each other. I can't imagine when they can't interact at all. So
yeah, there's some technical challenges as well. So you have to rely on people's internet connections. Yeah, there'll be a lot more to talk about once I can actually show it to everybody and let people kind of see what it is. And it is, by the way, found footage as well. It's going to be found footage. Oh, and one of my partners there on this project, Matt from Portronics Film Productions, he just said, damn, I missed the first part of tonight's show, which was, of course, relevant to what we were talking about. But Portronics is my partner with this, along with Bad Bob. So Portronics and it is Matt's company. And he was our director of photography for another project I've been working on, by the way. That's how we met. So he and I came up with this idea. It was actually Matt's idea originally, and I sort of tweaked it, that kind of a thing. But again, it'll be fun to talk about it more as it comes out. I mean, maybe when we get Matt on the show or something like that to talk a little bit about the process of making it and all that kind of thing. So, and he said, we pulled it off. We're almost there, Matt. We're almost there. It's still got to get edited. So we're almost there.
Well, very cool. Are we okay we're going to start off the show tonight actually with just a quick news item, actually. Eric, if you wouldn't mind sharing my screen here real quick. I think a lot of people have probably already seen this, but Joel Schumacher, the director, actually just recently passed away. He was 80 years old. This is from Variety. It says Joel Schumacher, director of Batman films and Lost Boys, dies at 80. This is by Carmel Dagan. And it says Joel Schumacher, costume designer turned director of films including St. Elmo's Fire, The Lost Boys, and Falling Down, as well as 2 Batman films, died in New York City on Monday morning after a long battle with cancer. He was 80. Schumacher brought his fashion background to directing a run of stylish films throughout the 1980s and 1990s that were not always critically acclaimed, but continue to be well-loved by audiences for capturing the feel of the era. Schumacher was handed the reins of the Batman franchise when Tim Burton exited Warner Brothers. Cape Crusader series after 2 enormously successful films. The first movie by Schumacher, Batman Forever, starring Val Kilmer, Tommy Lee Jones, Jim Carrey, and Nicole Kidman, grossed more than $300 million worldwide. And before we get into them talking about Batman and Robin, which is also confused in my mind anyway with Batman Forever, I just wanted to just take a moment and talk about Joel Schumacher's films. I've enjoyed pretty much almost all the movies that he's made. And there's several of his films that he's made that I quite adore. One of them is actually one of my favorite films. I've talked about, well, not just on this show, but on other shows about how much I love Batman Forever. I know it's considered a divisive film amongst certain fans, but I felt like that Batman Forever did a really great job of bringing some new elements to Batman and attempting to do them in live action and attempting, not always being terribly successful at times, but at least attempting to bring in a lot of elements that a lot of other directors have been scared to even try to touch because, how do you introduce Robin and how do you make that work? And I felt like Batman Forever, the first film, was quite good and I really enjoyed it back in the day. But he's worked on so many films, and we just want to take a moment to acknowledge his passing. I actually shared on my Facebook page. Some of you are friends with me on Facebook or follow me on Facebook actually saw it. Seal actually had an interesting little tribute and acknowledgement that he put out for Joel Schumacher on his passing. So if you're curious to see that, if you didn't see it, you can find that actually in my feed on my Facebook page, my personal Facebook page. Joel Schumacher has left us, and in my opinion anyway, I think he's left an interesting film legacy. Tell me, Erica, do you have any particular films with Joel Schumacher's that you quite enjoy?
I do like Batman Forever, actually, and I don't know if I consider it that controversial. Obviously, Batman and Robin is sort of almost universally panned, but I enjoyed Batman Forever. I liked Val Kilmer in the role of Batman. I thought he did a very good job, and at the time, I thought Nicole Kidman was just like the greatest thing ever. I mean, she's gorgeous. But it's interesting, this article, because I have this article up as well. I didn't realize that he actually got his start as a costume designer. And that's really interesting to me. I didn't know that. And it kind of shows in films like that, in films like, Batman Forever and also Batman and Robin. You can kind of see that his flair for costuming, because whatever else you say about those movies, some of the costumes are really cool. They're really excellent. I actually like one thing I do like about Batman and Robin quite a bit is Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy. I thought that if she had been given a little bit more to work with, it would have been even better than she was. And I thought she was really good as Poison Ivy. That's one highlight of Batman and Robin for me. In fact, I used to have a poster of her as Poison Ivy in my room, because I was so kind of enamored with her portrayal of the character. But I didn't realize that. I mean, did you know that, Dave, before you read the article, that he started out as a costume designer?
No, I didn't. I knew that he had a legacy in film that extended beyond film directing, and he had done other things, but I didn't realize that. And one of the things I will say about almost all of Joel Schumacher's films is that he brings a very operatic sense to most of the productions. When you look at the way things are staged, when you look at the use of music and light and costuming, it's very, it has a sense of drama about it that reminds me of opera. And that's one of the things I actually quite like about his films. It makes them distinct and unique. And the way that he's able to take that and apply it to so many different kinds of, genres, I mean, Batman Forever and Lost Boys, you'd think because of the Bat connection, they'd have more in common, but they could have less in common beyond the comic book connection and obviously bats, but it's interesting. It's very interesting. He has a really unique film legacy. And so I thought it would be fitting for us to take a moment and acknowledge his passing. The
one that I always forgot about and didn't realize it didn't come back to me. I think I knew it at the time when it was coming out, but it's been such a long time. Is Falling Down. I didn't realize that he was a director for Falling Down. And I remember that film. That film was very controversial, actually, when it came out. And it's going to be probably even more controversial today. It's going to be controversial forever. So it's going to have a sort of historical significance in that regard, I think. And that's, like you said, I mean, that's a very different kind of film in tone and everything in terms of his other work. And then another one that stuck out to me that a lot of people probably never even saw was 8mm. Are you familiar with that one?
I saw 8mm.
So did I. I saw it in the theater.
And I thought it was, I did too. I thought it was an interesting film. In a
lot of ways, it feels almost like an experimental film. It's very stylistic. It's really kind of a crazy film. I remember kind of almost feeling, and this sounds like a weird compliment, but I almost felt kind of sick after leaving. And I think that was what it was meant to do. I think it was meant to make you kind of feel sick as you left the movie theater,
Well, and in addition to that, I would say he also has some interesting films in his film legacy too that harken to a particular era. When you talk about St. Elmo's Fire, I mean, that captures kind of the 80s in a very genuine sense because it was shot in the 80s. But then you turn around and you look at a film like Flatliners, and Flatliners being made in the 90s. In a lot of ways, it captures that flavor of that era too. So it's very interesting, just all the different films he did and how diverse.
Falling Down does too. Falling Down,
Yeah,
I think,
yeah,
captures that
exactly.
era.
Yeah.
My father actually was an unemployed engineer. You know what I mean? For a large part of that era. So, I totally kind of understood where that was coming from, that not being economically viable. I'll never forget that. And it's also interesting that people probably forget, but the person who says that is actually a black man who's standing outside of the bank. He says that famous line that I am not economically viable. And then Michael Douglas has a sort of connection because you can both tell they're kind of in the same place. You know what I mean? So today, who knows if you could even get away with that? But that's an interesting part of the movie.
Right. Interesting. Very cool. Very cool. So yeah, we just wanted to take just a moment and talk about Joel Schumacher's passing here at the top of the show. But like I said, a very interesting film legacy. I think a lot of people, if you go to his IMDb and actually peruse all the different films that he worked on, I think you might be surprised. A lot of people think of him for specific films, but there's a lot of other films he worked on I don't think people are quite aware of. So I think they'd be a little
That was
surprised.
the case for me. That's the case for me when I read this article, for sure.
Well, all right. So are we ready to move on?
Yes, although James Stone is in the house, and he said, getting rogues.
Yeah.
Let's get your rogue on. Yeah, there we go.
All right, okay. So, all right. So I switched the graphic over. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the last episode of the Disney Gallery series, focusing on The Mandalorian. The title of this episode was Connections. But I think it'd be interesting at this point, too, if we want to talk about the Disney Gallery Mandalorian series in total, or in its totality, because now that we've seen all of them and they're all kind of assembled, obviously we want to talk about this particular one, but let's just go ahead and feel free to talk about it in whole. Now, obviously, this is on Disney Plus, so hopefully most of you have gotten a chance to watch it. I found all of them to be very, very interesting. I found this one to be interesting too, and I'm very curious to get Eric's take on this particular one with Connections. So let me just go ahead and say I really enjoyed this episode. I don't want to get too further into that until we get Eric's thoughts, and then we'll kind of go into it. So what did you think about this latest episode of this Disney Gallery Mandalorian series?
Honestly, it might be my favorite. I think it might be my favorite episode, and I really didn't expect that. So I think I went in with low expectations. I thought that this episode might kind of rehash Legacy a little bit, and maybe not really give us anything new. It might be kind of like, I even remember last episode I said, what does that even mean, Connections, exactly? But basically, a lot of it is it's an Easter egg episode. So I did like that, and it was interesting. But there were some revelations in this one that I really enjoyed. And I'm going to get my one bit of negativity out of the way. Right at the top. Kathleen Kennedy has very little role in this. Score would have been my favorite. You know what I mean? Because Kathleen Kennedy's not in it. She is in this one, but she doesn't really do anything. I think she has one line. So I am going to put that out there. That wasn't the reason that I enjoyed this episode. Although, once again, I will say, Dave, why is she there? I don't think she contributed anything of relevance. And it's very clear, by the way, because you mentioned talking about the show in totality. What did Kathleen Kennedy do?
Well, I mean, obviously in her producer role, she helped, facilitate, this particular production. But beyond that, I don't know. I would find,
I imagine, in the show to tell us what she did, what she contributed. Hey, I did this, I did that. That was my idea. You know what I mean?
I do. I do feel like her being in this is an attempt to recast her in a positive light by associating her with the Mandalorian, because I think she's taken so much flack because of some of the Disney War era films. So I do think her being in these is a very intentional thing to try and recast her in a positive light. But beyond that, you're right. I don't feel like, as far as, when you want to actually get into the meat of the episodes in which she's in, like as a commentator, in my humble opinion, I don't think she really contributes much to the conversation at all. So, and I preface my comments a little bit differently if I thought there was any chance of me ever working on Star Wars. But let's be honest, it's never going to happen, folks.
Well, I do want to say this because I think you made a really interesting point, in that there's a reputation that Kathleen Kennedy has ever since George Lucas left, that she's very much a micromanager, and that she's very much like a her way or the highway. In fact, numerous directors have been fired from Star Wars since her tenure started, and that's just a fact. And that's where the rumors come from, that she's sort of like, she's very hard nosed, and that, you do it my way or else. And I do see the contrast in this entire series, now having seen all the episodes, where now she's showing like, see, I can be laid back. I can let somebody else be in control. See, I don't have to be the center of attention. And I realized that could have been deliberate. That's actually good marketing, and that's good spin, as far as putting that out there that, see, Favreau's the one calling the shots. I'm allowing him creative freedom. I can work with other directors. I can let them shine. I think you really hit something there, Dave. I really do. I think that was intentional. I think that's intentional, because obviously this series is very much meant to market The Mandalorian, and also to help bring in a lot of the alienated fans into Star Wars. That's very clear. That's why I always talk about the Lucas loyalists. Right up to the end, Filoni is talking about things, Favreau is talking about things, always about Lucas. The Lucas loyalists, I mean, they're there. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and and along these lines, let me just go ahead and there's I gotta hit this one on, just come at this one straight on. I don't think this is my favorite of these episodes, but this is the one where I almost had kind of an emotional reaction, which I was kind of surprised at, because I haven't really felt that with any of the other. Like, I've enjoyed them a lot, but I haven't had like a really visceral emotional reaction. And I actually found myself really kind of touched and thought it was really kind of cool. And for those of you who haven't seen it, spoiler alert, a lot of the stormtroopers that we see in the last episode are actually 501st. And I thought that
I had the same reaction. I had the same reaction. Yeah. That's why it's my favorite episode, actually. That's exactly why it's my favorite episode.
And it was just so cool to see that. And it was neat too, because when they've got their helmets off, there's women there, there's men there, there's younger, there's older, and it's just it just made me feel good to realize that there's all these Star Wars fans getting to live out their dream of being in Star Wars, as a part of The Mandalorian. I just thought that was so cool. And then when you take that even a step further, and as you're going through the episode, as they lead up to revealing that the 501st are the stormtroopers, the other thing that was really interesting too is that besides the connections, one of the neatest things I thought about this was when Favreau was talking about it, and they wanted to have more stormtroopers in the scene, and they weren't sure how they were going to do it because they only had so many costumes, and they didn't have the budget to do what they wanted to do. And then he and Filoni kind of had this similar idea. It's like, well, let's see if we can get the 501st to come out and do this. And it was just so amazing. And if Favreau is talking about, this is when I had my emotional reaction. When Favreau was talking about, he's like, that they didn't really have to coach them on how to be stormtroopers, because they're doing all these events at hospitals, and they're doing these events at movie premieres, and they've studied it, and they're into it, and they know how to be stormtroopers. And then he says they are stormtroopers. And I was shocked that I had an emotional reaction watching this. And I kept thinking about, wow, that must be so amazing. You're a Star Wars fan, and you do, charity stuff with the 501st, to embrace your love of Star Wars, and you're really into it. And I was just imagining how magical it must be. You get this call to go do this event. You're not even sure what it is, but it's coming directly from Lucasfilm. So obviously you show up, and you're getting bussed in, and all of a sudden you turn the corner and you realize, wait a minute, am I going to be in Star Wars? That's it. Right. I can't imagine that. That was so amazing. I said, I had a very emotional reaction to it.
That's absolutely the highlight of the episode. It's like Okay, we're done, I guess. You know what I mean? That's absolutely the reason that I love this episode. It's because of that revelation. I had no idea that the 501st was involved in this production in any way, shape, or form. I have a lot of history of dealing with the 501st when I was staff on Phoenix Comic Con, and we used to deal with the local group, which is the Dune Sea Garrison. And one of my close friend of mine actually eventually was the executive officer for the Dune Sea Garrison, the local Arizona chapter of the 501st. He was actually their one and only snow trooper for a long time. He actually had a snow trooper outfit, so that was sort of his little claim to fame within the group. I used to work with those guys all the time. I used to talk to them, lead ups to the convention. We would meet with them and try to figure out events. One of the first events we ever did was a costume contest. We didn't even call it a masquerade. It was a costume contest. And we had one of the members of the 501st as our MC. And that continued for years. He continued MCing the masquerade. In fact, I don't know if he might still do it. I haven't gone to the masquerade for Phoenix Comic Con in a long time, or Phoenix fan, whatever it is now. But I'm no longer associated with that event in any official capacity. But I was at one time. I was on staff. And I think he was still doing that at least until the last couple of years. He's still been doing it. He goes out there into stormtrooper armor, but he takes the helmet off and he MCs the masquerade. So, there's that history there where I used to deal with them all the time. I used to see them at events all the time. San Diego Comic-Con, they were always very prevalent there as well. And you got to talk to these guys. I mean, obviously they're fans, and they're just a diverse, really interesting group of people. And the fact that they were actually allowed to participate in this, Filoni makes a great point, which is that, like, for them, having anything that's screen used is like the best thing ever. You know what I mean? If they have like a screen used prop, either as part of their costume or they have one of the blasters or something like that, that is like the end all and be all to them, because that's like the holy grail. It's like, this was actually on screen. This was actually used in Star Wars and it's part of my costume. Well, now every single one of those guys and gals that participated in The Mandalorian can say that. Every single one of their costumes and their props are screen used. That's a huge cred in that community, and that's a huge cred for anybody that's into that kind of stuff. It's like every single one of their uniforms now is screen used. It's official Star Wars. And that's, like you said, I even talking about it right now, I get that emotional reaction because I understand that as a fan, what that means to fans, that they have that connection. I don't think I'll ever have a screen used prop of Star Wars ever, probably in my lifetime, unless I become very independently wealthy and I decide to go on some sort of binge, But now every single one of these guys and gals, they have that. They have, screen used props from the Mandalorian. So that's absolutely the reason that I think that this is the best episode. It's just for that fact alone. Just the fact that I didn't know that, so it was a big revelation for me. I had no idea that happened, and the fact that they actually did that, I just think is awesome. I mean, it really shows you how Filoni and Favre operate, how they think, and how different they are from everybody else, to be honest with you. I don't think J.J. Abrams would have ever done this. You know what I mean? One thing I will say, kind of backing up to the beginning of the episode, and it kind of relates to this, is they talked about this notion that they are sort of the little brothers of Star Wars playing with their older brother's toys. And they're specifically talking about the films. They're talking about JJ. They're talking about Rian Johnson. They're talking about all those people. Those are the older brothers. They get all the good stuff. Okay, they get all the good stuff. And basically they're playing with all the used stuff. They even made the analogy that they have the Boba Fett figure and they repainted him. That's who the Mandalorian is. He's a repainted Boba Fett figure. Right. And I love that. I love that kind of stuff, that they acknowledge that's exactly what they're doing. They acknowledge directly, that the fact that the creatures that they're riding on and things, they come from the Ewok special. They made a point of that yes, they come from the Ewok special. That's where they come from. Things like that, I appreciate a lot as a fan. And I just think it's so cool that they're talking about that we're the guys basically using everybody else's toys. In fact, one of the other revelations was that the TIE fighter scene, not the TIE fighter, the X-Wing fighter scene where the X-Wings come in and actually destroy that station that the Mandalorian has been on. They borrowed that from Galaxy's Edge. They didn't even have a X-Wing cockpit. They had to borrow the one that's actually displayed outdoors. So it's not even meant to be a film prop. They use that. And it really makes me appreciate the fact that they're able to do this when they are the little brothers playing with their older brothers' toys, because for the most part, I think their older brothers suck. And I think their Star Wars sucks. The one exception is Rogue One. I think Rogue One is excellent. Love that movie. I own it. The rest of Disney Wars, in my opinion, is terrible. And it's just amazing to me that they took, the hand-me-downs of all that and came up with a much better product, in my opinion. A much better product.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool too when they were talking about actually that X-Wing sequence, and one of the things I really enjoyed was the fact that Favreau was so animated, because he's like that's just like what they would have had in the 70s, and you could just see his excitement, and that's the thing that's really neat. That's the thing I've loved most about this, is realizing that everyone associated with The Mandalorian, because to me, with the exception of Rogue One, because I agree with you, I quite like Rogue One, and I enjoyed Force Awakens. I didn't hate Force Awakens, but Mandalorian for me is up there with Rogue One as being probably the best of the new Star Wars that they've done. And for me, I just love the idea of knowing that there's so many people that just love Star Wars that are fans that worked on it, and to see especially Favreau, his excitement, and hearing Filoni talk about the connections to things. One of the other things I loved too in this special was when Favreau was talking about the gun that the Mandalorian uses. It has a tuning fork looking end on it. He was talking about, he was so excited, he couldn't wait to tell George Lucas. It's like, yeah, we took that from the holiday special, and because you wrote that, it's canon. And Lucas is like, I had nothing to do with that. That was so funny. And they have video of that on set, and Lucas is like, he's sitting there, he's like, I didn't do anything on that at all. I had nothing to do with that. I thought that was absolutely hilarious. So
I think that might be a little bit of revisionism by George Lucas, by the way. That might be a little bit of select memory that's going on.
I just enjoyed that moment, like the comedy levity moment within the series. I thought that was really funny because, for example, I can think of many instances where I, even as a comic professional, have been really excited about something that someone worked on. And then you run up to them at a convention, or you bump into them to like an after hours mixer for other professionals or something. And you're like, hey, I really like that thing you worked on back in the day. I thought it was awesome. And they tell you this story, like, oh, it sucked. And I wish I hadn't this, or I didn't really have that much to do with that. Or, just kind of shrug it off. It's like, and then you feel kind of weird. So it just helped me relate and click with Favreau even more, because I've kind of been there, where I was like, hey, we did this tie-in to this one thing, and I worked into the book because I love this. And they're like, oh, I didn't really have much to do with that. Why did you do that? And so, I've kind of been there. So I thought that was kind of funny and fun. And I thought it was cool too.
I totally get that as well, because in going to events and things like that, I used to go to the Writers Guild, the animation. It was the Animation Writers Caucus of the Writers Guild. I used to go to their reception every year at San Diego Comic-Con, and there's all sorts of stories like that. I mean, it's just a very common thing. If people are honest, and a lot of times they'll just tell you, yeah, you're like this. Oh, I love this. I love this. And like, yeah, I had nothing to do with that. You know what I mean? I had absolutely nothing to do with that. It wasn't me. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm glad you like that, but it's not me. It wasn't me. So I've heard that story many, many a time.
So just as a quick aside, did you ever meet or talk to Michael Reeves?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. All right. I decided to ask. I love Michael Reeves stuff that he's done, particularly in animation. He does a lot of interesting stories where he's constantly revisiting the concept of AI and kind of humanity. obviously within an animation concept. I think probably some of his best stuff that people would be familiar with is he did a lot of the hard act stuff that actually led to the robot Batman that appears in Batman the Animated Series. A lot of those ideas are Michael Reeves stuff, and so I just had to throw that out there because we never really talked about that before, and you mentioned it once before, and I was just like, "Did you ever talk to Michael Reeves?" Because every time I talk to any animation professionals, I'm always bringing up Michael Reeves, like going, "Have you talked to Michael Reeves?" You know, because I'm such a huge fan. So anyhow,
Gotcha.
well, so we've talked about this particular episode, and I don't want to get into everything that they did in it because I think it'd be fun for people to obviously watch it and revisit it. But there's all kinds of stuff that they brought from, classic Star Wars and even some of the newer productions like Rogue One that's all over The Mandalorian, which is really fun and cool to see. But I think we should also just talk about, now that we've seen all of the episodes, I think we should just talk about just The Mandalorian in total, like as a series, as an 8-part series. I found this to be very interesting, and I'd highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in process or just likes The Mandalorian or likes Star Wars. Especially if you have a Disney Plus, subscription, you're probably looking for some way to get your money's worth out of it anyway. Lord knows I am, because I don't know, I'm just not watching that much stuff on it, and being able to come back and watch this every week has been a lot of fun, and I've really, really enjoyed being able to watch these. And then beyond that, there's some really, really great stuff in here. I think the one about the score was really interesting. This one I think is a highlight or a standout for me too, as well as the one where they talk about sort of the concept and how they prevised. Of course, we talked about the volume, the video wall. They talk about that just briefly. They touch on that when they talk about how they recreated the cantina from the original Star Wars, which that was very interesting. How much loving attention to detail. If you're a Star Wars fan, if you love process, I'd say this is one of the more interesting ones I've seen like this. It's kind of a behind the scenes. It's a lot of fun. I don't think it's quite as dishy or in depth as, for example, like if you have the Aliens quadrilogy, I think they called it, set where they break down every single one of the Aliens films. Those are terribly interesting too. But this is one of the better ones if you're interested in behind the scenes stuff. I found this to be really interesting, and I highly, highly recommend it. So tell me, Eric, how do you feel about this as a whole and total? How do you feel about this series?
I think it started a little slow for me, but I definitely think it ended on a great note. The last 2 episodes in particular really stand out to me. The previous episode to this one's score is very unique. We talked about that in our review last week because it really does a spotlight focus specifically on the person who came up with the score for The Mandalorian. So it's very unique. All the other episodes, they basically go back and forth between 2 roundtables. One of the roundtables is the directors. So it's all the directors sitting around a table talking. The other one is basically Favreau and Filoni talking with the visual effects person. And then, as I've mentioned, Kathleen Kennedy is just there for some reason that we don't know. Bobby Chambers had a comment earlier. It says, "We know what you did, Kennedy." So I'll just leave it there. But most of the episodes, that's what they do, including this last one, actually. They just alternate between those 2 different roundtables. But in the score episode, they actually just have a roundtable, which is just Favreau, Filoni, and the composer. So it's very different. So it definitely stands out. As I mentioned, some of the earlier episodes, I just wasn't as into. That's not because I don't have any interest, in the directing process. I do have an interest in it. And then, Legacy had some good moments as well. I will say Legacy had some really good moments. Like Filoni's monologue about the importance of basically Lucas's vision. And really, he did this kind of intense defense of episode 1. If you're really interested in episode 1 and you're one of those people that really like it, you're going to like what Filoni had to say about that film in that particular episode. But it definitely, for me, got stronger as it went on because The thing that I was really interested in was the technical aspects. You talked about that visual wall. That technology just seems incredibly interesting to me. I keep thinking, and that's going to come into our discussion of Robocop later when we talk about Robocop. I keep thinking about the idea of combining stop motion with one of those projection walls, and if that would work. Because there's so many films where you see where they combine stop motion with live action, and it looks kind of fake. It doesn't look right. And I keep thinking in my head, I wonder if that would look better if you incorporated one of those digital walls. And it's like, maybe someday I'll have the budget to try that, because I think that would be an interesting idea. Or even an interesting way to remaster a film would be to do something like that. But anyway, there's a lot of good aspects to this series, especially if you're interested in filmmaking. If you're not that interested in filmmaking, this last episode is the one for you. If you just want to know about the Easter eggs and that's what you're interested in, then you can just watch the last episode. Just watch Connections. Maybe watch some of Legacy. Legacy might help you out too if you're just not really that into the process. You don't really care about the technology. I think those 2 episodes will stand out as a fan. In particular, I don't think we can emphasize it enough that 501st moment. There's some other really cool moments in this last episode. But if you're just a fan and you're just kind of interested in knowing, where are the Easter eggs? What are they all about? Maybe you're more of a casual fan. And for instance, you're not even familiar with the holiday special. You're not familiar with the Ewok adventure and the Battle for Endor. You're just not familiar with that stuff. They'll kind of key you in to, what that's all about. Because some of the Easter eggs are obviously much more obvious than others. I will put out there that one of the ones that I thought was really cool was the droid from the first Star Wars, the original Star Wars movie, the one with the bad motivator. They actually put him in The Mandalorian. And I didn't realize that. I thought it was a droid that just looked like him. So that's one revelation that I'll give out there that I thought was really interesting was they think that's actually him. That's actually the same droid. He's been stuck on Tatooine this entire time, and he's sitting there in the bar. Oh, and the other thing that I thought was neat that they talked about was and it relates to that, is if you recall in the original Star Wars film, the droids were not allowed to go into the bar, but now the droids are running the bar, which I thought that was a neat thing. I didn't catch that when I watched The Mandalorian. It's like, oh, that's true. That's true. Like before, droids were not allowed to go into the cantina on Tatooine. Now they're running it. So I thought that was a neat revelation as well.
It was interesting, and the assertion that maybe the droids now run the bar. I thought that was interesting. That they might even own the bar.
Probably not the poor. What is that droid? I always forget his name. The one from the original Star Wars. I always forget his name. The one that has the bad motivator and it pops up and stuff like that. The one that almost could have been R2.
R4?
He could have taken his place.
I thought it was
R4.
Yeah,
I thought R4 was Obi-Wan Kenobi's droid.
Oh, was it? Maybe it was.
Gets his head chopped off. Remember the droid that gets his head chopped off in Attack of the Clones? I think it's similar, though. I think it is an R or something like that. My brother actually had that toy. I remember that toy. He had it right next to his R2-D2 because I didn't have either one of them, and he had both of them. And he actually had the Sandcrawler set. The one that had the paper Sandcrawler in the background.
Okay, yeah.
And so he used to always have them set up like that. But I just think it's funny that poor droid is still stuck on Tatooine, and now he's just basically like a waiter or something like that.
Right.
And I didn't catch that. I thought it was just a droid that looked like him. So I thought
that was interesting, and that's what I'm talking about. Watching it, I thought it was very interesting how they showed, and again, the title says this, the connections, about how they went through and they found all these interesting ways to tie all these disparate elements into the Mandalorian. So it's a celebration of Star Wars. They talked about the personnel carrier, which was just a toy.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when I saw the Mandalorian, about jumped off out of my skin when I saw that, because that was so cool. Because I didn't have the personnel carrier, but I had a friend who had it. We used to use that thing all the time. So it was just really.
I remember people being like, "What the hell is this?" That's what I remember growing up. Is because people were like, "This isn't in the movie. what the hell is this thing? You know what I mean? People being like, but there were a lot of vehicles like that, especially like the smaller vehicles. You know what I mean? Which were more affordable. So a lot of kids had them, and we would be looking at them like, this was never in the movie. You know what I mean? Like, what the hell is this thing? You know? But they put it in. Right. They went ahead and put it in, and they made it canon. You know what I mean? So I think that's kind of funny. I think that's cool.
But no, yeah, like I said, I highly, highly recommend this series on Disney Plus. It was really, really interesting, and I think it's totally worth the investment and time to watch, especially if you're into behind-the-scenes stuff, if you really like The Mandalorian, or if you're just a big Star Wars fan, you're looking for something kind of fun and kind of new. I think for a lot of us, there's a lot of fun things to discover or even rediscover here. I did think it was interesting, a lot of the things they're calling back to, whether you want to talk about, Ewok Adventure, or you want to talk about the holiday special, that these things are not available on Disney Plus. So I did think that was interesting, that they're highlighting things that basically, as far as I know, I could be wrong, but as far as I know, I think the only way you can actually get some of this stuff would have been back in the day at a convention, back in that dark corner, or that back corner where there's that guy selling all those bootlegs. Like that's where you go to get your Ewok Adventure. That's where you go to get your copy of the holiday special, the Roger Corman Fantastic Four, that horrible Justice League Friends comedy TV pilot. Like, that's where you had to go. And it's interesting too, because there was also, back in those days, they just had a lot of stuff back in those little bootleg corners that you just couldn't get any other way. There's still a lot of episodes of Super Friends, for example, that the only way I saw some of those is because that's what I used to do back in the day. I didn't buy a lot of them, but I did. I specifically went back there one time to get a copy of Roger Corman's Fantastic Four because I really wanted to see it. And then I found some Super Friends, and that was the main thing I used to get from these bootleg guys, because they had all the Super Friends stuff on VHS. And there was no other way to watch Super Friends. It wasn't in reruns at the time. There weren't any sets out that you could buy. I mean, there was just none of that stuff. So it's just kind of interesting that they're kind of talking about things that you can't even watch on Disney Plus. So I wonder if there might be an initiative after this, at least with maybe Ewok Adventure and maybe Caravan of Courage, about maybe actually trying to clean up the negatives or whatever, if they can find that, of those films and kind of represent them and actually, make them available on Disney Plus maybe down the road.
Yeah, I would definitely like that, especially the holiday special, because the only time I've ever seen the holiday special is my bootleg copy of the holiday special, which is basically just somebody who recorded it on a VHS and then put it on a DVD. Bobby Chambers says the dark corner of the convention, quote unquote. This had my wife and I laughing. It's so true. Yeah, we all remember those days. The Ewok Adventure and the Battle for Endor were both released on DVD. They've never been released on Blu-ray. There were official releases of that. But the holiday special has never been released officially. George Lucas basically vowed that would never happen. But hey, he doesn't own the company anymore, so now we can have it. So come on, Disney Plus. Let's get the holiday special. Let's get the Ewok Adventure. Let's get the Battle for Endor. Also, the one thing I really is like, where's the Ewok cartoon? Where's the Droids cartoon?
Yeah.
That difficult to put those on Disney Plus. It's like, I don't understand a lot of that. So I don't know if they maybe there's some possibility of them maybe wanting to remaster it. I do know with the Droids TV series, because I have a copy of the DVD, which the DVD, what it did was it took like two different stories that were separate episodes and made them into like mini movies. So they're very highly edited. They're not the way they were broadcast. And they took out the Stuart Copeland song, Trouble Again, I think is what it's called, the sort of infamous theme of the Droids series, because I think there are rights issues. They don't want to pay him. They don't want to pay him. Right. He probably had a premium contract that basically gave him all sorts of residuals and stuff like that, and they don't want to pay him. And that stuff annoys the heck out of me because I don't like that. I like the original music as it was when I first saw the show. There's another famous example of that some people, it's kind of obscure, But Tour of Duty did that. Tour of Duty had this amazing soundtrack that was like a who's who of like 70s, late 60s music. And if you've ever seen it on TV ever again, or if you even got the DVD copy, none of that music's in it. It has the most bland, just they inserted some soundtrack into it, and it's terrible. So I wouldn't want to see that happen. I wouldn't want to see that happen to Droids or any of these other shows or something like that. Sometimes that's the issue. The music, really, it's the music sometimes is the issue. They just don't want to pay the composer because they usually have some pretty good deals as far as residuals, and they just don't want to deal with it. But I would like to see all those things on Disney Plus. I think that would be fun, and I don't think there's much reason not to. You know, I'm speculating on why they won't do it. I think a lot of it has to do with kind of burying that legacy. Maybe they're quote unquote embarrassed by it, you know. But Favreau's not. Favreau embraces it. Again, he's fine playing with his older brother's toys. It's just like that I think in a way it's very liberating for him because he feels a lot less pressure than a lot of the other folks do, which is ironic because when you think about it, Disney Plus is pretty much made by The Mandalorian. I don't think Disney Plus would be anywhere near where it is right now as far as subscriptions if it wasn't for The Mandalorian. It's the reason I got it. And quite frankly, I'll probably get rid of it, at least until the Mandalorian comes back. So, I mean, it got me in, you know, and I think it's pretty much the cornerstone of the entire service. And so it's kind of funny that Favreau just seems to have this very playful attitude that, you know, hey, we're just going to kind of do whatever we think is cool. We're going to take all this obscure stuff. We're going to throw it in there, and somehow we're going to make it work, you know, which I think they did.
So before we get too much further here real quick, since we've been talking about these different kind of ideas of bootlegs and different ways to experience some of this content, I'm going to put this up. I'm not gonna let the sound play because I don't want to get us in trouble. But I thought this would be interesting because I've talked about this before. Have you ever heard of Cybertronic Spree before?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Well, for those people who are not too terribly familiar, if you do a search for Cybertronic Spree, I thought it was Cybertronic Spree. Anyhow, if you do a search for them on, let me make sure let's make sure it's muted. If you do a search for them on YouTube, they have a whole bunch of fun covers. But as you could tell, these guys and gals, they actually dress as Transformers, and they do covers of a lot of these really great 80s cartoon songs and different things. So they actually have a cover of Trouble Again from Droids. So I wanted to put this out there because I'd mentioned it once before, and I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with them or not. But this is kind of the fun things that if you haven't been to a convention, these are kind of some of the kind of fun things you get to see and experience for those of us that are into this kind of stuff. So anyhow, I just wanted to kind of put this out there so people could see like this is like actually like really a thing, and it's pretty cool. This is actually a fun cover. Have you heard this cover of Trouble Again, Eric?
No, but now that you're talking about it, it's definitely something I want to check out. It sounds like that could be fun for sure.
Yeah. So anyhow, so I just wanted to put that out there, and I'm going to kill this real quick before we inadvertently get ourselves in trouble with something without realizing what we're doing. Let me go ahead and get rid of this too. No, yeah, I just wanted to point that out for those who are maybe not too terribly familiar. So yeah.
Bobby Chambers says Unicron on lead guitar. Houston, we love you. That is pretty cool, isn't it? With the Unicron out there. And sure. James Stone was talking about, he's waiting for the Tag and Binks Disney Plus series. And James, I know what that is. I have one of the Tag and Binks comic books, right? That's I think what you're referencing. That was a Dark Horse comic, I believe, was Tag and Binks. They did all sorts of nutty adventures within the Star Wars. It was kind of like a Star Wars comedy, kind of what I guess Lower Decks is supposed to be for Star Trek. That's what kind of Tag and Binks was, but they never got their own series. It was just a comic book.
Very cool. Are we good with that? Are we ready to get into maybe pop culture news?
Yeah. First, so James does say that's what he's talking about with Tag and Binks, and we miss Jane. Jane is in the house. Hey guys, and hey, back at you. Good to see you. Always a pleasure.
It just dawned on me I don't have the bumpers ready for pop culture news and for streaming wars. Let me go ahead and get pop culture news up.
Oh, this is interesting. So James says Tag and Binks says Lucas approved as well. He claimed it's canon. I never heard that before. Really? That's interesting because I remember some of the weird things that Tag and Binks did. So I think I would describe Tag and Binks as a really interesting concept. So basically the idea is, there's all sorts of people in the background. And I've always thought this would be a fun idea to do in Star Wars and a lot of other franchises. Like there's always sort of that random stormtrooper or that random rebel trooper or something like that. And that's what Tag and Binks was supposed to be. Like these guys are kind of witnessing all these huge events in Star Wars, and they're like the extras in the back. You know what I mean? And they're always having like their own adventure, that you never get to see. And I think that basic concept is actually really cool. I think you could do something serious with it too. Like it wouldn't necessarily even have to be comedic. Like I remember there was a Tales of Star Wars where they showed the perspective of the stormtrooper that Princess Leia shoots in the original Star Wars film. And it's a really good story. You actually like feel bad for the stormtrooper that Leia killed. I remember that. I was actually like, oh man, that's his story. That's like tragic. You know what I mean? It was really cool. So Tags and Bink was sort of a comedic take on that. And it's a really cool series. Maybe one of these days I'll bring it up again. Maybe we can review it if you can find it digitally. Because I believe I have I have a physical copy somewhere, Dave. I can review again. Maybe you can check it out. The digital version, we can review it or something like that.
No, yeah, and I keep threatening. I think we should actually take a look at that Battlestar Galactica 1980 series that came out a little while back. I think that would be fun to talk about on the show as well. So, because it takes a lot of the same concepts from Galactica 80, but it kind of puts it in a slightly different context and approaches it in a different manner. And it makes it very interesting and a little bit more in line with, I think, what a lot of our imaginations would thought Galactica 80 would have been. So, at least in terms of the concept of them actually making it to Earth. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
James does mention that one of the adventures of Tag and Bink was who shot C-3PO on Cloud City. That's one of the Tags and Bink's tales. I don't think I saw that one, but that's exactly the kind of stuff. Because who did actually shoot C-3PO? We never get to see that. We never get to see who actually shot it and what the story was behind that. So that's the concept. And I think that concept in general has a lot of potential. It would be cool to use more in other properties as well, I think.
No, yeah. I totally agree. Very cool. Are we good now to go ahead and segue into pop culture news?
Sure, segue away.
Okay, cool. And I've got the banner up if you want to switch it out. Okay, so here on the pop culture news segment, Eric and I talk about or bring up to you interesting stories or different things that's going on in the world of pop culture news. It could be a collectible, it could be a film, it could be a rumor, it could be anything that we find interesting that we think you should know about or that we think all of us might enjoy discussing on pop culture news. So do you mind if I go ahead and go first tonight, Eric?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. So let me go ahead and bring this over. So this is coming from Deadline, as you can clearly tell. I think everyone's probably already heard this, but this is being reported by Anthony D'Alessandro. And this is Michael Keaton in early talks to reprise Batman role for DC Universe, starting with The Flash. So it says Deadline has confirmed that Michael Keaton, who first played the big screen version of Batman in 1989 for Warner Brothers and its 1992 sequel, Batman Returns, is in early talks to return to the role once again. Keaton would play Batman in a Nick Fury-like role, starting with Warner Brothers' The Flash, starring Ezra Miller, and could continue to play the Dark Knight and other upcoming DC movies like Batgirl. Reportedly, the Keaton Batman won't impact the mythology being hammered out by Matt Reeves' reboot The Batman, starring Robert Pattinson as the Caped Crusader, and will pick up his storyline after Batman Returns. Andres Muschietti is directing The Flash from a script by Birds of Prey writer Christina Hodson. Barbara Muschietti and Michael Disco are producing. Keaton, who had already been working with director Tim Burton in Beetlejuice in 1988, was selected by the director and late casting director of Warner Brothers casting boss Marion Doherty for his Eyes. One source tells that this deal may not happen, but as right now, there are talks. So this has been reported kind of all over the place. I saw it all over Facebook. I mean, it's friggin' everywhere. I am a huge fan of the 89 Batman movie. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. I am a huge Michael Keaton fan. Initially, I had seen a lot of his early films like, Mr. Mom, Gung Ho, and then when they talked about casting him as Batman, I didn't have a huge negative visceral reaction, but I remember a lot of people being stunned by it and being kind of shocked by it. This show originally, roll back the hands of time, or at least my intro into doing YouTube shows, is actually in the studio retro retrospective. And on the Batman 89 episode, I shared, some of the newspaper articles and different things because I have a lot of clippings from that time. I was a huge fan of this 89 movie, and very, very huge. And it turned me into a huge Michael Keaton fan. Because of this, they had a magazine that actually came out with the 89 movie. And in it, they talked about his powerhouse role in Clean and Sober. Well, I actually searched out Clean and Sober and watched it and quite liked it. Even though it's a very downbeat sort of, dramatic film. But I'm a huge Keaton fan. I own, Clean and Sober. I own Pacific Heights. I think One Good Cop is a great movie. I'm a huge fan of Michael Keaton just in general. I even watched that like Love Bug reboot too, just because Keaton was in it. So the idea that Keaton could actually reprise his role as Batman is really cool. It'd be a really big deal for me. I would love to see him do that. I'm kind of curious the context of this because the reporting on this is very much kind of in line with this same idea. But I'm also hearing there's this stuff where, like, theoretically, supposedly, somehow the Flash movie still ties into elements of Flashpoint. I did work on the Flashpoint series. I actually worked on one of the spin-off series from Flashpoint. I worked on Flashpoint Wonder Woman. So I'm very kind of into the Flashpoint mythos. I'm very familiar with a lot of that. And then James Stone actually puts out Night Shift. Night Shift is a great movie. Great movie. A movie that's not talked about. I think it's about almost been forgotten, except for you and I, James, I think. No, I'm very excited about this news. And I really hope this comes to be, just because I had so much fun in the very brief amount of time that Kevin Conroy played Batman in the Crisis event, even though he plays sort of like a spoiler alert. Well, I won't throw the spoiler out there, but he's in Crisis. We covered that on the show. That's all over the news media. It's a different take on Batman than I expected, but I had a lot of fun with that. So tell me, Eric, what are your feelings about this news that Michael Keaton actually might return to play Batman in a DC film production?
Well, it's funny, I have to give full discretion. I remember growing up when the Batman film was first announced and seeing that Michael Keaton was going to be in it, and I was kind of like, who? I hadn't seen Beetlejuice, which I think Beetlejuice came out before Batman. Or did it come out after? I can't remember. But at the time, I didn't really know who Michael Keaton was. I was pretty young, and he hadn't made any kind of impression on me, other than I kind of thought he was, it looked like he was kind of balding. He didn't look like he was quite tall enough, any of those kind of things. So I remember as a kid, not, being like, who's gonna play Batman? Of course, once I went to the theater and actually watched it, I loved it. You know what I mean? And I thought he was awesome. So I was one of those people that was I wouldn't say a detractor. I was just a little kid, and I was just like, who is this guy? I don't think I'd even seen Gung Ho. I've seen all those movies since, but I hadn't even seen that, I don't think, before Batman came out. So I was kind of shocked. By the way, One Good Cop is also an awesome film. I agree with that.
I love that movie. It's a great
movie. That's a great movie. But that was, as a kid, that was my reaction. Since I've seen the film, since seeing the film, I think he was a perfect, perfectly cast. I do always argue I don't think he's a great Bruce Wayne. I always make that argument when I talk about, good Batmans and stuff like that. I say, well, what about Bruce Wayne? Because a lot of these guys are not good Bruce Waynes, and he's not a good Bruce Wayne, in my personal opinion. But he's an excellent Batman, and I enjoyed both films. I love the Batman film and Batman Returns. Both of them, I think, are superb films. I would definitely recommend them to anyone. So this, I think, is interesting. You kind of touched on the fact that we don't know how solid this is. We don't know how much this is wishful thinking. And then, of course, we take the angle a lot on this program that sometimes the marketing department is just floating things out there. They're putting out deliberate sort of misinformation, but it could be real. Like if they get enough of a positive reaction, which I think they are, there's a tremendous amount of buzz. But it's kind of interesting too, because you would think if negotiations are ongoing, that's putting Michael Keaton in a very good position when he's seen all this stuff trending and all that stuff, and he can ask for some real big bucks if he hasn't already agreed to something, because we don't know. We really don't know how far into the process this has gone. So I'm definitely interested to see how this plays out. I also saw that they were talking about using Flashpoint as an inspiration for this story. That it's going to be, obviously he's going to be introduced in the Flash movie, which I also think is interesting. And of course, this is a way to also sort of solidify the multiverse within the DCEU, because obviously the multiverse is solidified in the Crisis event on the CW, the DC CW universe, whatever you want to call that. But it hasn't been necessarily solidified in the DCEU. Another interesting point, one of the articles that I read was that people were talking about how this is a way also so that the Snyder Cut can kind of fit within the DCEU, because if the multiverse is basically established, then the Snyderverse is going to be easier to sort of explain and also to sort of put into the context of the other films. So it kind of makes sense. And it also makes sense because of the way DC does things. For better or worse, and I honestly think a lot of times it's worse, DC doesn't like to have continuity between their shows. They do have the CW verse, but for instance, Gotham had nothing to do with anything in the CW. Originally, Supergirl didn't either. Supergirl was on a different network, and it had nothing to do with the CW universe. It got canceled, and they decided to put in the CW and incorporate it into the CW verse. And the same thing with the films. The films have nothing to do with the television shows. So this would be a way for them to sort of incorporate that if they would like to, which I think is, to me, a no-brainer. But I've said that for a long time. I prefer the MCU approach over the DC approach. The DC approach is weird. Even as a kid, I never quite understood it. Even as a kid watching this Batman movie, the one with Michael Keaton, I would ask myself in my head, well, where's Superman? You know what I mean? Where's everybody? Where's Robin? You know what I mean? Where's everybody else? You know what I mean? Like, where's Wonder Woman? Because I knew from the Super Friends. We talked about the Super Friends earlier. I knew that they all knew each other and they all existed in the same universe and they were all friends and all that kind of stuff. So I would be sitting there watching these movies and be like, where are all these people? Why isn't there any reference to any of them or anything like that? Well, DC and Warner Brothers have always done it that way for some reason. Even with Man of Steel, I remember in the marketing, they specifically said, well, DC characters don't need to have the other characters. They can stand on their own. They're not weak like the Marvel characters where they have to be in teams. That was actually part of the marketing for Man of Steel. And then, of course, they had to eat all those words and say, no, Man of Steel was a prequel, to Batman versus Superman. Revisionism. complete 100% revisionism. That's why they don't fit. That's why those movies don't fit together. So DC's always had this weird approach, but if they did this would be a good way to finally kind of fix that, or at least a good step into fixing that, in my opinion.
Well, and I will highlight the Crisis event that the Arrowverse actually did, because the Crisis event,
that's what they like to call the CW stuff. Arrowverse. There you go. Yeah.
It does. The Crisis event did connect all the dots and say that all the different disparate, DC television shows, movies, whatever, that they all exist essentially within, quote unquote, a shared multiverse. Okay, not necessarily a shared universe, but a shared multiverse, and that they all at one time were connected. The big pivotal moment in the Flash one was actually the moment where the Ezra Miller, the Justice League Flash, actually met the Grant Gustin TV Flash, thereby also saying that the DCEU, which that's been dubbed by the fans, DC never actually called it that, but even connecting the current movies, with the shows, so that they exist in a multiverse, which to me, I always thought they should have done that anyway, because it plays into the ideas of the Crisis on Infinite Earth, comic book series, because in that, all those different versions of Superman, all those different versions of Batman over the years, they're all valid, they all exist, but they have their own, different timelines, their own different sort of, quasi, quote unquote realities in which that they exist. And a lot of these ideas were explored even further, I think, in Multiversity, I think it was called, which was a DC series they actually did somewhat recently. And even Convergence, the Convergence series actually touched upon this concept as well. So it all makes sense to me. I think it's really cool. It's interesting to see how the fans are lobbying. Some people like the idea that's put forth in this article as is, and they're like, hey, let's do that. I've heard some people, wondering, like, is he playing, Batman's dad version of Batman? Because in Flashpoint, it's actually Thomas Wayne who's the Batman, and he's a very more brutal, more vigilante version of Batman than even the one we're familiar with. Although the Batman v Superman one's very much a vigilante version too, but that's another thing entirely. We're talking in terms of the comics. But a lot of people are still lobbying. This has been ongoing for a long time. A lot of people are lobbying for him to be old man Bruce Wayne and be connected to Batman Beyond. I see that constantly.
Yeah.
That's what a lot of people, I think, would like to see.
No, I heard that too. Yuck. That, to me, that's yuck. I have a lot of problems with Batman Beyond. Huge problems with Batman Beyond. So I hope that's not what they're doing. I've heard people say that too, but I just hope that's not what they're doing.
I enjoyed Batman Beyond. I liked Batman Beyond quite a bit. But I'm going to say I would prefer that Keaton, if they do this, that he just be Bruce. Like the same version from the Tim Burton movies, just older, move his story forward, and just bring him into the DCEU, in this sort of, role or capacity or whatever. I think it could be really interesting. But it does create some problems for them too, story wise. Like, how does that work? How does that relate to these other elements? Like, that does, there'll be a lot of people, like, what we sometimes refer to as civilians. A lot of civilians are going to be really taken aback and not understand what's going on. I mean, if you can't hang with the world building that happens in Green Lantern in 2 hours, I'm talking about the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern movie. If you can't take that, like, that's too much for you. Like, all these different aliens with the power rings and all, like, and these entities, and like, if that's too much for you, there's no way in the world people are going to accept this idea that there's this multiverse and all these different things going on, and this is another Batman from a pocket parallel universe, and now he's in this one for this reason, and that, like, I'm just saying, it's like, if people had a hard time hanging with Green Lantern, that I don't know how they're going to accept this. So but we'll see. We'll see. And it causes weird problems too, because I was looking forward to Matt Reeves' Batman. There's been a lot of negative things that, well, in my mind, in my opinion, there's been some negative stories that have spun out of that during the shutdown, the lockdown, or whatever, things that are going on that don't sound right or don't gel with me, that have kind of made me kind of look at that film differently now. Originally, I was very excited about it, but as we've gone on and all these different stories have come out, I find myself getting sort of apathetic about it and being sort of like, okay, I guess we'll wait and see. But I'm not as excited about that production as I once was. But this sounds interesting to me if they do it right. But I worry about how the civilian, the casual moviegoer would be able to understand or accept what they're being told. This is the Batman from a different Earth. What? Did he come on a rocket ship? How does that work? So
well, ironically, Endgame might help them figure that out.
Yeah,
help them totally figure that out and understand it. So
right.
Marvel once again paves the way for what DC should have been doing the entire time. Just gonna say
it. But I'll say this too: without Crisis, that comes way before all of this. Without the Crisis event, I don't think you would have had what even happened in Endgame. So there's a lot of the snake eating its own tail going on here. DC broke a lot of this ground in the comics. You know what I mean? And then Marvel beat them to the punch and broke this ground in live action and cinema.
So you're saying that Marvel Comics never had any sort of parallel universe established before Crisis?
No, they had stuff, but it wasn't to the extent of what Crisis was.
Okay.
And you have to remember that Crisis actually goes back further than that. It goes even further back. The earliest quote unquote Crisis stories actually involved the Justice Society of America actually teaming up with the Justice League of America. And that predates a lot of this stuff going back to, I think, even the 60s or the 70s. So, DC broke a lot. All I'm saying is that DC broke a lot of ground with those ideas back in the day and sort of established kind of a lot of what we now just understand and accept as the concept of the multiverse. And then, Marvel was able to introduce that to a much larger audience, you know what I mean? And break ground with it.
Was it before Mirror Mirror though?
Well, no. You have I'm saying in comics they broke a lot of that ground.
Yeah.
Initially. Trek. We're not talking about Trek. That's a whole different conversation. Obviously that stuff, comes from Mirror Mirror and stories before, but anyhow, all I'm saying is that in the comics, a lot of what we accept as the multiverse, DC did a lot of that early work in the comics, is all I'm saying.
Right.
And that's been built upon, just like a lot of those concepts were built upon by what happened in Mirror Mirror. You know what I mean? Like it's that idea is that everyone's kind of adding to and building upon, so that when Marvel's able to do it live action, a lot of us have an understanding of what that is. So for those people who maybe didn't quite understand, we can turn to Aunt Betty and Uncle Jonathan and say, well, here's what's going on. Let me pause it. Let me explain what's. I get it.
It's like Spock with the goatee. It's like Spock with the goatee.
Yeah. Anyhow.
But I do want to bring this up since we're talking about this, because I read this actually in one of the articles that I was reading that was trying to explain this to the civilians, as you say. And one of the points that they brought up was a lot of this just started because of the comics crash in the 1950s when the Comics Code came about. Because what happened was tons and tons of comics were just destroyed. That's what happened to the original Flash in real life, to the original Green Lantern in real life. Their books were canceled. And so there's a lack of continuity between the original Green Lantern and then the Hal Jordan Green Lantern that came later, in the 60s. So what happened was DC eventually was like, we got to fix this. You know what I mean? Because people are confused. The kids are confused. They don't understand, like, you know, some of them can remember, or their parents can remember the original Green Lantern or whatever, and they're like, wait a second, how does this fit? You know what I mean? And you mentioned the Justice Society and the Justice League and the fact that they started making them work together almost as like separate teams. But of course, Justice Society had Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman, and those ones had been in constant publication the entire time. They never got canceled. So that was the mess that DC was trying to fix, was because they had these characters, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, that had been in continuous publication, but then they revamped characters like the Flash and Green Lantern and others, where they had an original version, you know, that they started back in the 40s, and then when the Silver Age came, they redid them. They redid the characters completely. You know, in fact, I think the Flash, right, is considered the beginning of the Silver Age of comics, was the debut of the new Flash. So that's one of the issues that was also going on, was that DC was trying to fix all those continuity problems.
And then also too, for those people that are into trademark and copyright law, another aspect of this too is a lot of times they have to bring these older versions of the characters out and have them in quote unquote constant publication in order to maintain the trademarks, you know, the rights to the different concepts and the costumes and whatever. They have to do that in order to maintain the intellectual property from a legal standpoint. So sometimes some of this stuff is sort of just to reinforce, you know, the brand legally and get it all under a current copyright in order to push that, you know, however many years past whatever. I forget exactly how the law works at the current. I always have to look it up, but in order to keep them an active publication, in order to make sure that they can actually protect the intellectual property that they quote unquote own. So
that's how they lost Captain Marvel. That's how basically DC lost Captain Marvel. That's why we call it Shazam now, which Shazam's not his name. Shazam's the name of the wizard. He's Captain Marvel. You know what I mean? But they lost the rights. Now we have, you know, Brie Larson's Captain Marvel. That's what happens. You know, it is what it is. So
anyhow, I wanted to bring this up as the you know, this is pretty much my whole contribution for pop culture tonight. I figured we'd talk about it. I thought there'd be more activity from the Rogues about this particular topic. Everybody might have been talked to death on it on Facebook. This is the first I've really talked about it, to be honest. Eric and I right now. I wanted to react to it when I first saw it, but I wanted to actually save it for the show. So these are my thoughts on it, and I'm very excited at the idea of this. Like I said, I'm a huge Keaton fan, and I hope this comes to pass. I thought he was great as the Vulture, even just recently in Spider-Man, and I thought it was fun to see him actually return to that, you know, sort of big blockbuster superhero movie and see him play a villain. I thought he was so great in it. And at moments, you know, when he isn't even in the suit, like the scene where he's got the pistol and he's talking to Peter in the car on the way to the prom or the dance or whatever, like, he's terrifying. So I could see him playing that Thomas Wayne vigilante version of Batman and pulling it off like with no problem whatsoever. But I could also see him just reprising his original version of Batman that he played in the Tim Burton movies too. So just have to wait and see what they do. But if they decided to have him play Thomas Wayne and go that direction, that would be interesting. I think it'd be really interesting. And if they wanted to have a connection to other versions of Batman, you know, if they go that route, that's a way they could kind of connect the dots if they wanted. So we'll have to wait and see what they do. But I do hope this comes to pass in some form, because I'd love to see Keaton just back as Batman again. Just for me personally, I think that'd be a lot of fun. As long as
you're not the only Keaton fan. James Stone says my folks got Mr. Mom and Gung Ho from the old double VCR exchange program. And James, I can say I'm not really familiar with the double VCR exchange program. You would have to explain that to me. But yeah, I have seen Gung Ho, and I do enjoy that film, but I didn't see it at the time that it came out. I saw it years and years later as an adult. So.
Well, like I said, the films I could definitely highly recommend if you like Keaton, or if you're not terribly familiar. Obviously, the '89 Batman movie. I would highly recommend One Good Cop, Pacific Heights, and if you want to see a just totally dramatic turn, and you're not afraid of something a little bit more, sort of downbeat, Clean and Sober is very interesting. I think at one point he was talked about possibly being nominated for an Academy Award for Clean and Sober, which at the time was a big deal because prior to that, a lot of people forget he'd been doing stand-up comedy prior to doing Mr. Mom and Gung Ho. He was seen as primarily just a comedic actor. So it's very interesting to see how we think of him today versus, the stand-up comedian that I originally saw like on the late night talk shows doing comedy. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously he's one of those guys, kind of like Tom Hanks, that started out very much as a comedian, and then got into more serious roles. There's no doubt about that. And James clarifies he's talking about old school VCR bootlegging, which we were talking about earlier. We were talking about the convention center earlier.
Corner of the convention.
I am familiar with that.
Yeah. All right, very cool. So tell me, Eric, what's your first story that you have for tonight for pop culture news?
All right, let's see. A lot of this could be used for streaming wars, so let me see something that's not necessarily 100% streaming wars. So a lot of this stuff, obviously, when we talk about content, like this is a good example. This is technically a streaming content, but when I talk about content, I don't consider that necessarily streaming wars. When I talk streaming wars, I'm really more talking about the business aspects and major moves that are being made. And I do have some stuff for that earlier, and it is related to some announcements about some movies and television shows and where they apparently are going to end up. But this is a Screen Rant article. We haven't really talked about Star Trek in a while, but we were talking about the Mirror Universe just a little while ago. So this Screen Rant article, it says Star Trek Next Gen characters could appear in Lower Decks animated show. Star Trek Lower Decks creator Mike McMahon hints that the new animated series may include appearances by some legendary Next Generation characters. Now, I have to say, I wasn't too enthused about the picture they chose here for fairly obvious reasons. If you've watched the show, if you're new to the show, check out our reviews on Star Trek Picard, and then you'll understand why I kind of thought this wasn't really the best picture to go with. Just me. But it says Star Trek The Next Generation characters may appear in the upcoming animated show Star Trek Lower Decks. As CBS All Access goes for maximum Trek coverage, the streamer is getting ready to add to its roster of shows with a new animated series focusing on the unsung worker bees of Starfleet. Entitled Star Trek Lower Decks, this new show is the brainchild of Mike McMahon, an executive producer on Rick and Morty, and the co-creator of Hulu's new series, Solar Opposites. With that resume, McMahon is clearly a huge fan of both sci-fi and comedy, and indeed Lower Decks figures to take on some of the same mix of genres and sensibilities that inform both those other projects. A while back, fans were afforded a first look at the diverse array of characters who make up the cast of Lower Decks as the 10-episode first season gets set to debut sometime in 2020. So they are saying that Lower Decks is going to come out before the end of the year. I have seen another article where they said that Lower Decks is on schedule because with the shutdown, and Hollywood is still shut down essentially, animation projects are still going forward because they are able, a lot of people are able to work at home. They don't necessarily have to interact with each other. In fact, it's very rare now when it comes to recording animation that actors interact with each other anymore. They pretty much always just record their lines and they patch it all together later. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of why Lower Decks appears to still be on schedule. So one thing that they had a quote here, it says from McMahon, it says there's a lot of recognizable characters in the galaxy at that point. Next Gen is my favorite era, and as a huge Trek fan, I would definitely want to try to use some of them so that I could not only build out the world, but also work with some of my heroes. But I can't get more specific than that. You'll have to wait and see. Now, what he's referencing, by the way, is that this series, I believe, takes place right after the events of Nemesis, if I'm correct. So it's before Picard. but it's after Nemesis is when the events of this series take place. So the idea is that the Next Generation crew could very easily be still out there running around on the Enterprise, and therefore you could have crossovers where these characters would show up on Star Trek Lower Decks. And this is just a little intro to the main characters of Star Trek Lower Decks right there. This is a previous announcement that they made a while back. But I'm curious, Dave, if you had heard about any other buzz about Star Trek Lower Decks and what you think about possibly some of the next gen people coming on the show.
I saw some of these stories when they first broke, and I'm looking forward to Lower Decks. I think Lower Decks is one of those things that'd be a lot of fun actually to cover here on the show, because we've talked about doing kind of more. Well, I've talked about doing more stuff with animation on the show. But in addition to that, too, obviously at Star Trek, we're both huge Star Trek fans. I love Next Gen. My love of Next Gen has been damaged by Picard. I've stated that before. I literally can't watch Next Gen right now. I turn it on, and as soon as Picard shows up, I just want to turn it off. But maybe this is a way that maybe it could kind of help get me back into Next Gen. And I was just thinking about it'd be so much fun to have, for example, Data, or to have Riker, or any one of the, even Barclay for that matter. It would be really fun to have some of those fun next gen characters, as a part of this. I think that could be really cool. And that's a neat way they could do it, because they're just providing the voice, and then they're animated so that, for example, Brent Spiner always talks about, when he talks about revisiting Data, he always talks about how he doesn't want to play Data, quote unquote, as an old man. That's not something he said specifically. That's my alliteration of what he's always said. And of course, even with Picard, we have to revisit that idea yet again, and put a nail on that coffin, no pun intended or implied. I mean, they literally did that. So
they literally did that.
They literally
did that. Yeah.
So this is a way in which, if they could get Brent Spiner to come back, he could play Data in his prime, and he can relax and just revel and enjoy being Data again for a little while. I think that would be kind of fun, even if it's a little bit part. So I think that this is a great idea, and myself, if I were working on this, I would love the opportunity to have Michael Dorn come back and be Worf, for part of a segment or something. It could be really fun. So it makes sense to me. I think it's unfortunate we keep having to talk about Nemesis. How many times do you have to keep talking about this takes place after Nemesis? We need something that's past Nemesis so we can stop bringing up Nemesis. That's my whole feeling about this. Literally, when you said takes place after Nemesis, my eyes rolled so much they almost fell out of my head. So that's my feelings about it. I'm looking forward to Lower Decks. I think it could be a lot of fun. I love animation. I know my brother's a huge fan of Rick and Morty. I've seen a couple episodes of it, and it's fun what I've seen of it. So I'm very excited for this, and I think it'd be something to talk about on the show.
So I did go to the panel at Star Trek Vegas in last August, and I did see the panel on Lower Decks, and I came away pretty excited about it. Much more so than Brent Spiner. The one that I always hear complain about the makeup is actually Michael Dorn. As you said, Brent Spiner, I think, has lost some credibility because he actually did play old Data. So we'll just leave it there. But Michael Dorn did not appear in Picard at all. And one of the reasons they say Michael Dorn isn't that interested, although he did say at Star Trek Vegas he would do it. He did say, because he was asked, and he said, but you could tell he's reluctant. Michael Dorn does not like being in that makeup. And all the rumors. In fact, they even said that at the convention. LeVar Burton was joking with Michael Dorn about all that Deep Space Nine money, because the rumor out there is that they paid Michael Dorn quite a lot of money to be on Deep Space Nine because he hates the makeup. So to me, it would be natural if he could be in an animated series, and he has such a distinctive voice as well. Michael Dorn has a great voice. So to me, he would be a natural. So that's the one that I'm hoping for. I would like to see Michael Dorn back, of course, as a Klingon, not as a Klingork. And by the way, this is the last chance I'm going to give for New Trek. This is something I think that's different. It's supposed to be a comedy. It's supposed to be lighthearted. So I'm going to give it a shot. I don't have CBS All Access right now. I got rid of it because there's just not anything right now that I'm interested in. I don't like New Trek, but I'm going to give this a chance. And so I think at least the first episode, Dave and I will probably review on this program. And I am hoping that Michael Dorn and maybe some other characters wind up on the show. I think it would be cool.
And when you consider that these are sort of the crew members on the lower decks that maybe maintain ship systems and such that we wouldn't typically think about, for example, like, pulling from lower decks specifically, it would be interesting to see, maybe this cast of characters, because they always had issues with the Defiant, for example. That's the way they could bring Michael Dorn on there, and maybe they're attached to do some kind of a service maintenance upgrade, or maybe they work briefly on the refit of the Defiant, and that's the way that they could have Michael Dorn kind of reprise Worf, briefly, and have these characters kind of interact, Well,
I should specify, these characters are actually not the main characters of Lower Decks. This is the command crew. So this is like the chief of security, the captain, the first officer, and the doctor. These are actually not the main characters. The main characters are up here, but unfortunately, we've got this picture of somebody else that I don't really want to talk about right now. These are the main characters. And yes, they're the support crew. I just want to clarify that because these guys are actually the command crew, and they are not the main characters of the show. That's why it's called Lower Decks. These folks are. And they're all supposed to be like junior officers. Well, except for the old guy in the middle.
All right. Well, there you go.
So,
all right,
sorry, folks. If you've never seen the show before, check out some of our Picard reviews, and you'll understand why I'm talking like that.
Yeah. No, I'm not. Yeah. Well. Yeah. That's where I'm coming from, anyway.
I'm pushing for Michael Dorn. I want to see Michael Dorn in Lower Decks.
That would be fun. So I do have my other kind of pop culture news story I want to do. In hindsight, Eric, I think kind of dovetails into what you were talking about, that it's almost kind of a streaming wars story. And I wanted to talk about it in sort of a broad context. I think we both probably know what I'm talking about, even though we don't. And just so everyone knows, we don't typically work out like our news stories in advance with each other, just so that way our reactions are genuine when we bring them up, what we want to talk about. So I think that you and I have a similar through line. I think we both have a news item that could be either pop culture or streaming wars. Are you thinking it's more streaming wars?
I don't know exactly which story you're talking about. So, because I've got multiple that can kind of go either way. Let's
say it involves a snake.
That one I think is streaming wars because I think that one's important for.
Okay.
That's important for the industry. There's a sort of game changing thing there. You know what I mean?
Okay. So
plus, yeah. If you're talking about, because I have that one, I have that one queued up. If you want to talk about that. Because we're talking about a change of venue.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? We're talking about a change.
Yeah, I think we're talking about the same. That's what I'm saying. I think we have the same sort of topic. And when you were mentioned earlier before, it made me think it's like, oh, well, maybe this is a streaming wars story more than necessarily a pop culture story. So so that was my second pop culture story. So I'm just going to push that to streaming wars. So if you have something else for pop culture, maybe go ahead and bring it up, because I think mine is probably more streaming wars.
Okay, I've got another one that I think is kind of fun. For folks that aren't familiar with it, there's a company called Hero Collector. This is from HeroCollector.com, and they make various models. I think mostly of Star Trek ships, but they have other things as well. And they'll usually have like a guide that comes with them. I haven't got one. I've seen them. I've thought about getting them, but I just haven't got one. Well, I think I'm going to get one now. So they're doing one for the Orville. Actually, they're doing 3 for the Orville. So this is from HeroCollector.com. It's the first look at the Orville ship collection. So we've got 3 different ships. two of which are a little hard to kind of distinguish what the difference is. But here's one of the first models here. So this is a model of the Orville itself. These models are very small, just so you're aware of that. They aren't very large, but they're going to have one of the Orville itself. Then they're also going to have another one that is the shuttle. So they're going to have a model of the shuttle come out as well. And then they also have this other, well, that's the Orville. Why did it say that was the Orville? That was the Orville right there. Okay, they both look like the Orville. I don't know exactly what the difference is. You can see there's three different models. I just can't tell the difference between the two of them. It says that there's two regular ships plus a stunning XL model of the Orville itself. So, but it's going to be coming out, I think, fairly soon. I don't know a whole lot about this, other than, like I said, I've seen them. I've seen the Star Trek versions before, like at stores, conventions, and things like that. They are fairly small models, but they come with like a book that will basically tell you all about the ship and, you know, all sorts of other stuff. I'm looking forward to this, and I think that might be cool. There's very little. It's a 16-page full-color magazine that comes with each. It includes a profile of the ship. It also includes concept art and behind the scenes of the show. So I haven't seen a lot of stuff about Orville merchandise. So I think this is pretty cool. I don't know if you heard about this, Dave, or if you're familiar with this company and the stuff they do with Star Trek.
I am Hero Collector is sort of the U.S. version of what Eagle Moss. Eagle Moss is actually the company on either last episode before last. I showed the little die-cast metal figure of Deathstorm from Brightest Day.
Yeah, I remember that.
I actually own two Eagle Moss figurines, Deathstorm and Grifter, and both of them were gifts, and it's just kind of crazy because both of those are actually based off of DC Comics characters I worked on. So that's the thing that's really tricky for me.
Very cool.
And I have a bunch of friends who collected the actual ships. I haven't from Star Trek because they do a lot of the Star Trek ships. I don't have any of them just because I found myself at this point where I had to determine like how much more collecting I was going to do and how I was going to do it. And I decided to kind of limit my expenditure that I do on collectibles. That's just me personally, what I decided to do. I think the last two major things that I actually asked for that I actually got, which I showed earlier, I have a Hot Toys Michael Keaton Batman. I have an Adam West Hot Toys Batman. And the closet, I actually have a Heath Ledger Joker. I don't ever get it out. But I have a few things that were really kind of pricey. And I just kind of said, I don't know how much further I want to go into this because I started with ships. I had a real hard choice to make because I wanted to get them, but they're pretty expensive. Not the Orville ships, but the Star Trek ones, because there's a lot of Star Trek ships. You know, there's just
these are available for pre-order now. Which I didn't actually check what the price was. Here, let's click on the Orville. Let's see if that pops up here. Because you can pre-order these right now. $30. That's not too bad. They are small. I know they're very, very small models and stuff like that, but they come with the book, which is kind of cool. And for people like you and me, by the way, because I have the same problem, I have to be kind of selective in what I collect. So I am looking for smaller items now. I can't really justify anything that's large. You know, I can't really justify large items or even like the size of your Batman. I can't really justify that right now. I just don't have the space for it. But I could probably do something like this. You know what I mean? Because they are pretty small. And as I mentioned, there's really not much of any Orville merchandise that I'm aware of. So in that respect, I think these would be kind of cool. It says they're going to be available for delivery in October. So if anybody's interested in that, you can go check that out and maybe get some cool Orville collectibles.
No, yeah, I think it's really cool. I had seen this because there's also a company that is, and I can't understand because Tom Constantino, who actually works on the Orville on Twitter, he's constantly posting like updates of there's some company making prop replicas of the different weapons and props and stuff from the Orville. I'm a huge prop collector guy. It's funny, Eric, you've never actually been to my house, so you don't know how bad this collecting problem mine really is. But
I know how bad mine is. And as I've mentioned multiple times, my biggest problem is virtually everything I have is in boxes. I don't have anything displayed. And it's almost like, what's the point? Why am I collecting if I'm not displaying this stuff?
Right. So I'm a big prop guy. So this is obviously a Star Trek communicator. But it doesn't stop there.
You're a prop guy, you say? Yeah, you have a communicator?
But I have more than one type of communicator.
That just happened to be right there. That's just funny because it just happens to be right next to me right now. That's awesome. That's really cool. That's from the original pilot, right?
No, this is Wrath of Khan.
Was that Wrath of Khan?
Yeah, this is Wrath of Khan.
It looks like the original one. Because Wrath of Khan, they had the wristwatches in Wrath of Khan.
No, they do a little bit of the wrist communicator, but this is the one that Kirk has when he's talking and he's biting on the apple, and he does this whole speech about I don't like to lose.
Interesting.
But this is actually the style of communicator actually from Wrath of Khan. And then
it looks so much like the original one too. It looks so much like the original communicator from the pilot.
Yeah, I think it's intentional. And then I can't get to them because they're over there, but I've got every version of the phaser except I didn't pick up the official release one from Star Trek 3. I almost bought it, and then it's the one that Uhura has where Mr. Adventure, she's like the blood pumping, and she makes him sit in the closet. And so, can you handle him? Oh, I have Mr. Adventure eating out of my hand. I almost picked up that one. That's the only one I don't own. But I've got the one from motion picture, obviously classic original series Trek. I've got a next gen. I've got the one from Star Trek 6. It has the clip and the slide out as if it's like a Glock or something. So. I'm a huge prop guy, and so I've been paying particular attention to the prop stuff more with the Orville. But they keep putting up updates, but there's not any real hard information as far as I could tell about how you would or would not order them. But along those lines of expensive things for those of us that are into props, since you brought up the Orville thing, I thought I would bring this up just briefly. If you will. Share my screen, I'll show the expensive prop I'm trying to talk myself out of. So Entertainment Earth, this is available for pre-order. It's coming out in September, but they're actually releasing, this is the prototype style of the Boba Fett helmet. Had you seen this?
I had not.
This thing is cool. But it's the Boba Fett helmet, but it's the prototype version. But this thing looks really cool. This is the kind. This is the thing I'm like going, I don't need this. I don't need this. But for $100, I'm still not. It's tempting.
It's tempting. No, I would say definitely, yeah.
We both know why I can't do this. Those of you watching the show, we'll be finding out soon enough while I'll be not buying any more props for a long time. But anyhow, basically, long story short, I can't afford this anymore. But we'll get into that soon enough. But this is a fun, expensive prop. I find myself going. But I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it.
Yeah,
I have willpower.
Cool. No, that is pretty cool.
Yeah, this thing's neat.
Yeah, that looks pretty cool.
So, And they go great with my prototype Boba Fett that's standing right over there watching me while I do the show. He stands right there and watches me.
Giving you moral support, huh? There you go.
Yeah, I have prototype Boba Fett over there. That's one of my favorite costumes of all time. And then I have one of my favorite uniforms over here because Admiral Kirk watches over me on the other side. And that's one of my favorite uniforms of all time. I love the Admiral uniform for motion picture. So
very cool.
Look at us talking about collectibles. We're going to get labeled as a kid show if we're not careful.
Yeah, I think that issue seems to have been a little bit overhyped. So thankfully, which is one of the reasons that we're talking about collectibles more on our show. So
what a shame I deleted my entire YouTube channel. There you go.
It is what it is, right?
It felt like 10 freaking years to get 100 people subscribed and deleted it overnight. Short-sighted on my part, but oh well. There you go.
But we're going to be talking about YouTube and streaming wars right now, aren't we?
Oh yeah. If you wouldn't mind, let's segue over to streaming wars. All right, so we'll just set this up real quick. So here on the streaming wars segment of the show, we talk about anything that's happening that we find interesting in the world of the streaming wars. This obviously relates to streaming video. We're primarily talking about a lot of those services that you, our dear valued viewer or listener, are probably already subscribed to. Things like Hulu, things like Netflix, but also things like, for example, that may or may not be coming out. Things like the Peacock, HBO Max, Disney Plus, that Apple one, whatever the name of that thing was again. Anyhow, anything interesting that we find that we think that you might also like to discuss and talk about, that's what we cover here on the Streaming Wars. So talking about the Streaming Wars, Eric, if you don't mind, if you would let me lead off. I don't have a news article that I want to put up. I just have a graphic I want to put up, and I think it kind of sums up, the main thing I want to talk about tonight, and that's this.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It's crazy. It's crazy. So this, for those of you, obviously hope you're watching, but you're seeing this right now. This is the coming soon placeholder right now on Netflix for Cobra Kai. Cobra Kai, which of course was a YouTube series. Cobra Kai, starting with season 3, is actually coming to Netflix. And then Eric, I think you have an actual news article that's probably worth actually bringing up. I just wanted to show everyone this because I just can't. This is crazy to me. And I'm very excited because I loved Cobra Kai Season 1, and I loved what I did get to see of Cobra Kai Season 2. But I was one of those people, I wanted to pull the trigger and re-up to watch Season 2, and then for one reason or another, it just never seemed to work out. So I didn't see all of Season 2, but I saw quite a bit of Season 2. But I loved Season 1. And I'm very excited to know that Cobra Kai is coming to Netflix because it means, 1, I can rewatch Season 1. Number 2, I can obviously catch up on Season 2. And number 3, not just Season 3, but I'm hoping I can talk Eric into actually covering this actually for the show because I love.
Oh, yeah, that's a no-brainer. That's a no-brainer now. That's absolutely a no-brainer because I have Netflix. That's why I'm so excited about this. As Bobby says, no mercy, no mercy. Absolutely. Well, what's interesting is, okay, so by the way, Orville Nation's in the house. He says hi. He loves Retro Rogues. But he said something that, of course, he's too kind. PJ, you're always too kind. He says, this is the best content on YouTube. And, of course, I would argue you have the best content on YouTube, PJ, because you do excellent content. You do excellent interviews, all sorts of great stuff. But I think the two of us, Orville Nation and Retro Rogues might be the best stuff on YouTube because Cobra Kai is not there anymore. That's the big story. That's why this is Streaming Wars news. So basically, YouTube is getting out of the sort of scripted series, game. So YouTube Red was a massive failure. They are conceding defeat. I think Cobra Kai was the last thing they were holding on to, and now Netflix is taking Cobra Kai. This is a really big story in that regard. Now, granted, YouTube Red, they don't even call it YouTube Red anymore. I don't even know what they call it now. They call it like YouTube Premium, I think. So YouTube Red, they even got rid of the whole YouTube Premium still exists, which is essentially YouTube Red. But they've conceded defeat, which is kind of interesting because, YouTube has had this tendency, especially right now, a lot of creators are talking about this, where they keep offering more and more corporate fluff. And then here you had a great scripted show that YouTube was producing itself, and they're getting rid of it. It's really kind of weird when you think about it.
And it's interesting, too. I want to point this out because when we had first started talking about and covering the streaming wars here on the show, I had always kind of theorized that I thought the first casualty of the streaming wars was probably actually going to be the DC Universe app, because I didn't understand how the DC Universe app was going to survive or move on once HBO Max actually came out, because I just assumed that content would be rolled into HBO Max. And now we have DC Universe app is still over here trying to go strong. They got Stargirl, and they've got the couple seasons of the new Harley Quinn show, which some people quite enjoy. I haven't seen any of those because I haven't re-upped my DC Universe app subscription service. But you've got DC Universe is still over here going strong. And then here's YouTube letting go of an initiative that they started, because they were one of the first combatants, if we're talking about it. They were one of the first combatants in the streaming wars. And then here comes Netflix, and they're just gonna sweep the leg and take Cobra Kai.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's really interesting. Now, of course, YouTube is still very much a player in the streaming wars.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, absolutely. We've talked about that. YouTube actually, where they really kick everybody's butt to this day, is in mobile streaming. So if you're using one of these things to do your streaming, or a tablet or something like that, everything says that you're probably watching YouTube over any of the other like subscription services or even free services that are available.
I can't get it to stream on this, though.
Eventually they're going to have one that you can. I'm sure. Eventually they will. Sure. So Cobra Kai, I've got the Hollywood Reporter article here. It says Cobra Kai moves to Netflix as YouTube officially out of scripted. So they're officially out of the scripting game. The first 2 seasons will join the unaired third of the Karate Kid sequel, starring Ralph Macchio and William Zabka, on the new platform. So they have found their new home. I think this is a no-brainer, by the way. Dave was talking about it. We are definitely going to be reviewing season 3 on Netflix. I'm looking forward to it. I've seen a lot of good stuff about this show. I've seen many of the episodes. I've really enjoyed it. The one thing that was keeping me from completely going into it was I didn't want to subscribe to YouTube Red. This was literally the only thing that I saw on YouTube Red that interested me at all. So I decided, I didn't deal with it. You know what I mean? I just was like, several episodes were put out for free. I watched some of those. You can watch a lot of trailers for the episodes on YouTube for free. And then also what's interesting is YouTube has actually, been pirated, by itself. In other words, people will take key scenes from Cobra Kai and they will cut them and put them as YouTube videos. I don't know if you've seen some of that content, Dave, but I think it's kind of funny. So people will people are talking about certain things that happen in the series. Well, I've seen them on YouTube, but not through YouTube Red.
Sorry about that. I'd seen a lot of that. Actually, a lot of the stuff from season 2 was the same thing. I had actually seen it because people had, pirated it and then put it back out there for people to view. Mm-hmm. And I had actually been trying to watch season 2 actually when they made those episodes available, but they're only available for like a short window of time. Right. And I was so busy. I tend to have so much going on that it's hard for me to dedicate a lot of time to anything anymore. And so it was just one of those things. It was like, I'm always having to choose. Do I keep this or do I lose this? Because there's only so many hours in the day and there's only so much time. And so unfortunately, Cobra Kai was one of those things. And it wasn't that the show wasn't good enough. The show was great. I really wanted to watch it. It was the fact that it was also behind the paywall. And it was was sort of one of those things. It's like at the time I was looking for what I could get rid of. And it was just like I had already decided, because it was a huge dearth. There was a huge. It's just like with CBS All Access, but with CBS All Access, I'm always finding something interesting that I'm enjoying. Like right now, my wife and I are making our way through The Good Fight, and I can't recommend The Good Fight to everyone, but I've been really enjoying it for what it is. And they keep introducing elements into the show. Like one of the main characters took up Aikido in the second season. And so there's sequences where she's doing Aikido, and I love Aikido. And, one of the investigators that works for the law firm, loves graphic novels and comic books. And we see him drawing, and they actually bring that in a later episode. It actually plays a part in a later episode. So with CBS All Access, I'm always finding something else interesting that pulls me in. But the big thing that pushed me away from YouTube was that whole thing that actually caused me to get rid of my channel. It was that whole quote unquote crackdown on content creators. Right. And that was the thing that made me pull out of YouTube and just walk away from it in a big way. Because I had been debating about re-upping because I wanted to watch season 2. I was having to make a choice about time, and then all that stuff happened. And I was like, well, forget this. And I deleted my YouTube channel. And when I walked away from everything, including Cobra Kai, because I didn't want to be in the middle of all that. I just didn't, even though I wanted to see more of the show. So even when they made it available, I missed a lot of it because I still right now, I'm not paying the amount of attention to YouTube that I had been. I just not. That whole thing did a real number on me. And so I'm very excited about this because this is going to end up being a huge win for Netflix. That's the funny thing. This is going to end up being a huge hit for Netflix once it gets over there. I know there's all kinds of people that wanted to watch Cobra Kai when it first came out, and they weren't doing it because they didn't want to pay for YouTube, but almost all of them already have Netflix. So There's going to be a lot of people that's going to just love being back in the Karate Kid universe, and this thing's going to be a huge, huge hit for Netflix.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you. I think it's going to be. I think it's going to expand the fandom. I think a lot of people that like the movie that didn't get a chance to watch the show, they're suddenly going to realize, oh, that's what all the hype was about. That's what people were talking about. This is so cool. This is so good. And I think that it's just going to explode. But I do think, again, I want to emphasize that, you talked about the reason that you got out of YouTube and the reason that you don't have a channel on YouTube yourself right now. It's just kind of funny, the mixed messages that are going on with YouTube right now and have been for quite a while, because a lot of us feel like we are being pushed out as independent content creators. And I think some of us might have thought it was because they wanted to do more sort of scripted stuff. Well, clearly that hasn't worked out for YouTube the way they thought it would. I think Cobra Kai was really their only legitimate big hit. There were some other shows. In fact, there's, I think, 2 other shows that are cited in this article that I'd never heard of that did find other homes on other platforms. But I never heard of hardly any of the YouTube stuff. And I remember looking at it when Cobra Kai first came out, and I wasn't really interested in it. So it's kind of interesting. So it's kind of, in a lot of ways, YouTube has kind of gotten what they deserve, I really feel like, because really their bread and butter are the independent content creators, people like myself, people like Dave, people like PJ from Orville Nation. Those are the people that really make YouTube what it is and make it a fun environment to be in. It's not all the corporate fluff, which they seem to keep piling on, and they keep piling on these rules. When COPPA first started, they were telling people consult a lawyer. Yeah, like I have an entertainment lawyer that I can just call and tell me what to do about my channel. So it is an interesting move in terms of basically YouTube saying, yeah, we're not even going to keep trying this anymore. We're out of the scripted show business, and hopefully, this is my hope. Hopefully, that means that they will start concentrating a little bit more and treating their independent content creators a little bit better.
That would be nice, and to even drive this point home even further, I have actually a story from when I used to teach martial arts that actually kind of plays into this, and what happened with me on YouTube. Um, in the dojo I used to train in, we had one of the guys who's an assistant instructor, and he had like really long hair, and our sensei used to constantly like grab that hair and actually use it as it's kind of like for leverage and as almost a lever, and he would throw him all over the dojo when we used to train, specifically when we do the black belt level classes. Well, we had someone sign up to take classes, and this other gentleman had long hair. And so he told him, he's like, you have to be really careful about that in a defensive situation, blah, 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 whatever. And he actually turned to this other gentleman and said, I want you to teach him how to protect himself because he's got this long hair. That's something that you've been learning to have to deal with. So I'm going to give that charge to you. Now, again, this guy was an assistant instructor. And so when he told him, teach this other gentleman how to protect himself, the next class he showed up and he cut all his hair off real short. So that's kind of what happened with me on YouTube. They said, consult a lawyer to protect yourself. So guess what? I cut off YouTube. That was my solution. So there's a martial arts analogy to go along with what happened with me on YouTube. Now, and it's weird because prior to that, man, I was on YouTube all the time. There was all these shows that I used to enjoy. There was all this stuff I used to just be really into. And then ever since then, I've just been kind of very distant. I think Orville Nation is the only show I really still follow on YouTube. And it's just because, I love the Orville, and I'm excited to see what's going to be happening, and we're friends now with PJ, and I want to support him. But there was all these other shows I used to watch. I used to be a big fan of, and I don't watch any of them anymore. I mean, it pretty much killed it for me in YouTube. And now the only stuff I watch is when Eric's like, you need to watch this. Are you aware of this? And he'll send me stuff, and I'll watch stuff specifically for the show. But other than that, and I've been watching training videos actually on YouTube right now, because I have been watching that. So I have been watching a lot of training videos, but we'll get into what that's for soon enough. But no, yeah, it's funny because when I think about all this and thinking about Cobra Kai and YouTube and their premium service or YouTube Red or whatever, I just think about how they pretty much killed it for me, with some of their decisions that they've made. And again, that's just my personal opinion. That's my own personal story, my own personal reflections upon it, and just the unfortunate nature of where I found myself. And in order to protect myself, I just had to cut off YouTube.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did that. I think there's a lot of people that backed away and all that kind of stuff. Of course, the people that were most concerned were mostly the people that were reviewing toys and things like that. They really felt they had no guidance and had no idea what the hell they were going to be doing. But most of those channels seem to still be around and don't seem to be having any problems or anything like that. So I think some of it was overblown, but YouTube didn't help. YouTube didn't help. They didn't provide support. They didn't provide guidance or anything like that. So again, my hope is that now that they're kind of getting out of that scripted game, they are going to focus more on their independent creators and hopefully not so much of the corporate fluff. But you mentioned earlier that you are still supporting CBS All Access. I'm not, by the way. I no longer have my subscription to CBS All Access. I plan to reactivate it when Lower Decks comes on. I didn't find anything on there that was, calling to me or making me want to keep that. But, I shouldn't say but. Some other people might find this stuff interesting. I don't know what I think about this, but there's some big announcements from CBS All Access, and this is actually a follow-up to last week because we were talking about the Viacom CBS sort of reboot, the rebrand, the super service they were talking about. Well, this appears to be, there's two big stories that appear to be going in that direction. So the CEO, I guess, is trying to make good on his promises. So it says, this is from the Cinema Spot, and it says exclusive live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series in the works at CBS All Access. Very, very little information. I have to say, at first, when I looked at this, I was like, really? Dave and I, we talked about the toys that made us, and that the first episode is about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I don't know if you remember this from how long it's been since you watched it, Dave. But one of the things they said, the biggest mistake, and it created a huge rift between the creators of Ninja Turtles. They said one of the biggest mistakes was a live action television series. That was one of the biggest mistakes they ever did. It was also one of the biggest bombs for Teenage Ninja Turtles, that live action series they did, which was geared towards kids. It was on, I think, with the, I want to say it was like the Fox Kids setup or whatever with their network, well, there's very little information right now about this live action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series, but this is what they said. It says, this is a synopsis. So it says, no, the series is set to adapt The Last Ronin, okay, which is the upcoming Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 5-issue miniseries from IDW Publishing. And that comic is set to be released later this year. Now, here's the synopsis of the comment. In a future New York City, far different from the one we know today, a lone surviving turtle goes on a seemingly hopeless mission to obtain justice for his fallen family and friends. Now, this is going to be on CBS All Access. This is starting to already give me like PTSD about Picard again. When I see that synopsis, that's what I'm thinking. So I'm curious if you heard about this, Dave, and what do you think about this particular story, which hasn't even come out yet in the comics, being adapted for a live show, apparently because I guess Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles aren't dark enough?
Well, here's... I hadn't heard this. But oh, this is interesting. Now, James Stone has something on here. He actually puts up, hate to be a buzzkill, but if you go to Kevin Eastman's Facebook, he put the hammer down. No plans for a live show. I saw it this morning. Well, if Kevin Eastman's reporting that, it's probably true. But I will comment on this.
It's fair to mention that Kevin Eastman does not own the rights to the Turtles. He's involved with the production, basically at IDW and Nickelodeon's discretion. That also was part of the Toys That Made Us documentary. I know that. He doesn't have any rights. So I'm not saying that I'm not trying to dispute him, but I just want to put that out there as well, as he does not own the rights to the Turtles. They don't have to tell him anything.
Right, but I know that I think Last Ronin is actually his story he's working on too. Well, let's talk about it in an esoteric sense. Okay. I love Dark Knight Returns. Okay. And I quite enjoyed Old Man Logan. Okay. Take that a little bit further. I enjoyed the Logan movie. These are all interesting examinations of these characters and kind of how their story, their journey ends. I talked about before, one of the things I like about the Masters of the Universe movie is, in my mind, I always reconcile the Masters of the Universe movie as being sort of Skeletor and He-Man's final battle, so to speak, even though I know Eric keeps bringing up the I'll be back moment at the end. But to me, that's always how, in terms of canon, in terms of storytelling, that's how I've always looked at that movie. Skeletor's finally gotten control of Castle Grayskull, and this is their big final epic battle, and that's where that's where that story kind of sits in my mind. Okay, I'm curious to read the Last Ronin story that I know Kevin Eastman has been working on. I'm very interested in that. I'm not sure how I feel about the idea of seeing that in live action already. Sometimes
I need some clarification here, because Bobby's saying Eastman wrote the Last Ronin story 30 years ago. He says it was influenced by The Dark Knight, and then he says the comic looks great. So I don't understand. It's obviously IDW is doing their own thing. So is this based on a story from the independent era? Because I don't know enough about Teenage Mutant Turtle comics to even comment on that. But he says that story is 30 years old.
Well, here's the thing. I was not reading Turtles at the time that because I thought Last Ronin was something that was currently being worked on in the comics form, because I thought I'd seen some stuff where Eastman was posting about that they were getting ready to do this, and it was I feel like we got to go to the internet. This story is bringing up a lot of fact checking.
IDW is doing their own version of this story. What I don't understand is whether this is a new story or if it is based on an old story, and now IDW is simply adapting it to whatever the current, Teenage Mutant Turtle comic verse is. Bobby has a little more clarification here. He says he is working with IDW. This is a story he brushed off and planned to save for the future. There we go. That's the clarification I was asking for. That's an old story that he's going to revisit. I get it.
Yeah, and see that's what I was talking about, because I know Last Ronin is a series that's currently being worked on for IDW, and right here it says the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Last Ronin is a 5-issue comic series from IDW Publishing by TMNT co-creator Kevin Eastman, with co-writer Tom Waltz and inker Andy Kuhn, taking the characters 2 decades into a future first imagined by Eastman and co-creator Peter Laird for a storyline that never saw print. So, this is a current. Last Ronin is a current series, and that's kind of my point I'm trying to make. I would like to live with this story a little bit before anyone tries to just run and adapt it, because I feel like Logan was such a touch mark of a film, and Dark Knight was such a touch mark of a comic series, that everyone's rushing to do this. When they were talking about Picard, Patrick Stewart kept referencing Logan in the same breath when they would talk about Picard. And my fear is that sometimes in a rush to tell an ending for a character and put an end to it, that, it's sometimes it's not always the world's greatest idea. So because I haven't even had a chance to read Last Ronin, I would like to actually read it and live with it a little bit before we run around and we try and adapt it and do something with it. That's my whole take on this entire story, is that I feel like that we need to live with this a little bit more before we look at just running it and adapting it. That's my own personal take on this story, if it makes any sense. Just in a purely esoteric sense, even if this is just rumor and not necessarily true, which in every thing there's always some small kernel of truth. All I'm saying is that, true, untrue, I feel like this story is maybe a little bit too new to even be thinking about trying to adapt. I feel like you need to make sure people are in to this idea before you take the Turtles down this road.
Yeah, that's an interesting take there. Personally, what I can see is somebody at CBS All Access saw this pitch and was all like, "That's a great idea," because that's almost just like what we did with Picard. That's my take on it. Somebody right, over there heard this and said, "That sounds like a great idea. That's exactly the kind of crap that we do." So, I'm not commenting on the comic. I don't know anything about it. I'm just saying that, first of all, it was widely reported in The Toys That Made Us that basically Eastman and Laird thought that the live action Turtles television series was a complete disaster, which it was. It was a ratings disaster, and it caused a huge rift between them that they never mended. They never mended that rift that was created by that show. So I think a live-action Teenage Mutant Turtles series is problematic to begin with. But this particular story, I think is very problematic with CBS and its track record, because they have this tendency of wanting to make everything darker and hopeless and disgusting and revolting and just unwatchable. I mean, that's just the only way that I can put it. And it's funny because you're talking a lot about Logan, and you're right. They made all those comparisons to Logan,
right,
and Picard all the time. They were saying that this is basically like Picard's Logan. And I haven't seen Logan. I haven't seen it. That's one of those that I've been interested in seeing, but I never got around to. I'll be honest. I thought, the first Wolverine film was a huge letdown, and I never went back. I was like, I'm not checking out the Wolverine films. I did like what was the crossover where they crossed over the two X-Men, the older X-Men and the younger X-Men. Days of Future Past. I did like that. I did watch that. I did like that, but that was after Wolverine's origin. That's the only time I've seen Wolverine again. After I saw Wolverine's origin, I was so disappointed. I was like, no, I'm not watching the Wolverine movies anymore. I got tricked once. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So I didn't go back.
I don't own X-Men Origins Wolverine. I don't like that first Wolverine movie that they made. I do, however, it's not the greatest film made, but I did quite enjoy the Wolverine that sort of attempts to adapt elements of what they used to call the Samurai Saga from the X-Men and the Wolverine comics. There's a lot of stuff about that movie I like, but I love samurai culture. Like, it's a big thing for me. I trained a lot of the samurai arts for many years. You can't watch it anymore, but I used to have videos on YouTube you could see back in the day. But I did Aikido, Kenjutsu, Iaijutsu or Iaido. Like, I trained with the sword and the whole thing. I was very obsessed with samurai culture and methodology and everything. I love that era, that feudalistic Japan era. And it's funny too, because a lot of people would think it comes from a lot of the comics and stuff, but it actually doesn't. It actually comes from when I was a really young kid. I actually saw the TV adaptation of James Clavell's Shogun. And that's where my love of samurai actually comes from, is actually Shogun.
That's a great series. That's an awesome series. Yeah, I love that series as well. That's a great series. And
so there's a lot of stuff about the Wolverine I love just because it touches on that. There's some really great fun battles where, basically it's, Wolverine versus a samurai, that's really fun. But Logan is a great movie in a lot of different ways. It's just a great film, period. Whether you look at it as a modern take on a Western, whether you want to look at it as just sort of the kind of Wolverine's ending story, it's a great way for him to go out. It doesn't really adapt a lot of all of the hard-hitting elements and the really twisted stuff that actually comes out of Old Man Logan at all. It's very much its own story. But it's really great. Logan's really great. But I don't think sometimes when you see people take inspiration from these things, sometimes I don't feel like they quite understand what it is that makes that special, what it is that makes that unique. There's a lot of surface, stuff that misses, the underpinning of what's going on. The thing that makes Logan great is if you've grown up reading Wolverine comics, and if you've enjoyed a lot of the X-Men films that they've made over at Fox, and you just love that stuff, you're more invested in that story than you would if you're just a casual person viewing it. Some of the biggest moments in Logan are because if you're familiar with Wolverine's story, you kind of, I didn't really see it was coming, but that twist really got me, So that's just what I'm saying. Is just I see the want with CBS All Access because they did with Picard about going, hey, let's do a dark futuristic turtle thing.
Right.
But until I get the chance to actually see what Eastman originally intended, I don't want to watch a show about it. And to be honest with you, as much as I love Dark Knight Returns, as much as I love Watchmen, and a lot of these the sort of the dark deconstruction of superhero stuff, you have to live with it a little bit before you're ready to see it in a different form. When I first read Dark Knight Returns, it was kind of shocking at times. When I first read Watchmen, it was shocking at times. And you kind of have to live with it, and digest it, and think about it, and almost kind of look at it as a work of art, and look at it as a work of literature, and see what it has to say, and what it represents within the genre, like the comic book. Comic book is a genre, right? Or a medium, before you turn around and adapt it into something else. To adapt something just because it's a dark futuristic take like Logan, everyone needs to stop doing that right now.
I don't think they're looking at adapting it. I think that some executives saw the pitch and thought that was a great idea. That's my thought. That's what I think is going on. I don't think they've seen anything of the comic. I don't think they give a crap about the comic, because they never do. The studios never give a crap about the original source material. That's just the way they are. I think they saw the pitch and thought that was a great idea. Sounds just like Picard. You know what I mean? That sounds like a great idea. That's my take on it. Now, I do have another story about CBS All Access I want to get to, because we're running too long. So I just wanted to get this out here too, because this is also about CBS All Access. So this is from Cord Cutters News, and it says the new SpongeBob movie is heading straight to streaming. Now, this is pretty significant. So basically, originally the SpongeBob movie was supposed to be hitting theaters August 7th. And then it was pushed back to 2021. Well, in the wake of Universal and their debut of Trolls World Tour on VOD, which has caused a ton of controversy, and then we haven't talked about it, but Warner Brothers also decided to pass up theaters and release Scoob. Scoob was an animated film that was supposed to be released in theaters, and they decided to also do it straight to VOD. So now we have another studio, Paramount, which is part of Viacom CBS, that has decided to completely bypass the film, basically the theater industry completely. So there will be no theatrical release, and now they're going to put this straight to video on demand, and then after it's on video demand for a period of time, it will go to CBS All Access. So this is pretty significant in terms of what the industry is doing right now. It's amazing to me. I shouldn't say it's amazing to me. It's just sad to me in a lot of ways that the film industry is throwing the theater industry under the bus the way that it is right now. There was a story last week that I didn't get to bring up about The King of Staten Island. That's another film that went straight to VOD. There was actually a number of drive-in theaters and independent theaters that had opened. There were about 100 theaters that were set to show that film, and then Universal just pulled the plug. And now there's a feud going on. We've talked about it before between AMC and Universal, where AMC is basically saying they're not going to show Universal's movies anymore. So this is another interesting front of the streaming wars, and basically CBS All Access, their parent company, Viacom CBS, has now joined this, and they're really throwing some major shade on the theater chains. And I just wanted to bring that up because obviously it ties into CBS All Access. It ties into our previous coverage where we talked about Viacom CBS basically rebranding CBS All Access. And apparently they're going to get the entire catalog of all the SpongeBob shows, but they're also going to get this movie after it's on VOD for a certain amount of time. Then it's going to go to CBS All Access. So my question to you, Dave, is I'm really curious what your take is on this. If you see this, what I'm seeing, which is this trend that they're really, really throwing the theater chains under the bus and all the independent theaters as well.
I can see it as a trend, and it's unfortunate. But I honestly, it's weird because a part of this is a product of what's happening in the moment. It's just a reaction of what's going on. They have to find a way to get some of this content out in order to recoup some of these production costs. And I understand that part of it. But there is a, well, for lack of a better word, we'll say a lack of loyalty to the theater industry. But we don't just see this in this particular story, even though we didn't talk about it too much. We did bring it up, I think, last week or week before last, probably in the pop culture segment, but we talked about the idea that DC Comics has decided to break from Diamond and just kind of go their own route with different distributors. And there was some people, shop owners, certain people within Diamond who obviously took that as an affront, because there was no loyalty. There was no, I thought we were an industry that supported each other. There's a percentage of that in this story, and there's a percentage of truth to that. It's weird because I know, like I said, part of it's out of necessity because of the moment in time in which we find ourselves in. But then secondly, too, I think a lot of this was coming down the road eventually anyway with some of these studios. And some of the films, too, a better way to put it, some of the films, while they may seem like a great idea, maybe they wouldn't play out quite as well, in theaters, So I don't know. It's I think it's unfortunate, but like I said, I could see where, not necessarily from a business standpoint. I mean, a business standpoint, it kind of makes sense to an extent, even though it does seem short-sighted. I think some studios probably were thinking about moving this direction anyway, because look at what's happening with the streaming wars. Everyone's got their own service. Well, they need content for that service. It's got to come from somewhere. And then I could see where they're wanting to recoup those costs by lessening their risk. And for films that they might feel are on the fringe, or they don't think could do terribly well at the box office anyway, well, let's just roll them out VOD and get them out of here. My thought process is going to be, if we make it through the fall.
I could definitely see that. I think that there's short-sighted. I think it's short-sighted because I think eventually the theaters will open up again. There are theaters that already have opened up. And of course, we've talked about drive-ins. I actually have several stories on drive-ins. I wanted to talk about that, but we're really short on time. But because I support that. I would like to see drive-ins flourish again. I think that would be awesome. I would love to have my local drive-in back because I used to have one really close to my house. But it's amazing to me. I just think that everybody's kind of piling on because now you've got Warner Brothers, you've got Paramount, Universal basically started this. And the funny thing is, when Universal started this with Trolls World Tour, nobody really faulted them. And the fact of the matter is, Trolls World Tour was actually released in the few theaters that were open. Like the one drive-in that's still around in my metro area, in the Metro Phoenix area, it's actually in Glendale, Arizona. They were showing Trolls World Tour. But now what's happening is they're doing these exclusive VOD things. They took it a step further, and it's like right when the theater industry is really in bad shape and really needs some assurances, these studios are taking them away, and I think it's just tremendously short-sighted. I don't think that these streaming platforms are going to be able to support the revenue that they think they're going to. I think everybody thinks they're going to be the next Netflix because I think I believe that's the way they think. And they don't understand that really that's not the way it's going to be. The future, I think, is going to be very diverse in terms of media. I always use the analogy of vinyl records, and I call it the vinylization of media. And I think what you're going to find is more and more of these things. And I think it's part of why I want to talk about the streaming wars so much, because I think everybody's chasing Netflix and saying who's going to be the next Netflix. I don't think it's going to be that way. I think what you're going to have is you're either going to have, some sort of consolidation. It's going to be like cable all over again, or you're going to have a lot of these smaller sort of, smaller outlets. that are profitable, but they're nothing like Netflix. You know what I mean? In fact, we've actually done some coverage of some outlets that are looking. They have that strategy. BritBox was one that I remember we talked about. The BritBox was kind of looking at that strategy where they have a much smaller subscription base, a paltry subscription base. But you know what? It's profitable for them. They're making money off of it. So I just think that they have to realize that they need multiple revenue streams rather than putting all their eggs in one basket. And right now, I think the industry is trying to put all their eggs in one basket because they're panicking. I think they're just panicking. And they're just, like I said, they're just throwing everybody else under the bus because they don't know what else to do.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I don't want to comment too much just on this story, just because that's a huge Pandora's box, and if we're concerned about time, we should probably just move on. But that's a huge topic, and it's one that's terribly relevant with everything that's going on within the theater industry, within the studio, system. I mean, it's a huge question they have to ask themselves, and we see it quite often. Where, and see it play out in different forms, where an industry seems to throw away an important business partner that was always there before, that all of a sudden it's like, we don't need you. And then they try to move on, and then that segment of an industry or whatever dies, and no one seems to reflect much upon the importance that they represent. And then a lot of times, certain industries, they come back to those things going, oh, this is a great thing that we lost. We should never have stopped doing this. It's an important part of what we're trying to do. And then it turns into, can you bring it back, or is it done? So only time.
That's why I call it the vinylization of media. I'm coining that term. I'm going to trademark it.
All right, there we go.
Because that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened with vinyl records. So
yeah. Are we good to move on to our last topic for this evening?
Yes, that sounds good to me.
All right, very cool. So set it up here just real quick. So tonight for our retro review, we are going to be talking about Robocop. Let me just, right off the bat, let me just go ahead and put my disclaimer out there. This is one of my favorite movies of all time. So this is from 1987. This is Robocop. Read you just a synopsis here, just a little bit of brief information. This is coming from IMDb. In a dystopic and crime-ridden Detroit, a terminally wounded cop returns to the force as a powerful cyborg haunted by submerged memories. This is directed by Paul Verhoeven. It was written by Edward Neumeier and Michael Miner. Stars Peter Weller, Nancy Allen, Dan O'Herlihy, and Kurtwood Smith, Ronnie Cox, Miguel Ferrer. It's got a great cast, just a really great cast in this movie. So in order to do a retro review, we want to talk about obviously how we first heard about the film. And we also want to talk about how we feel about the film after having just recently watched it today. So start out by talking about how did we first hear about RoboCop and what was our first experience watching the film. I'll start off. I'll try to be real brief. I heard about RoboCop because I saw an ad on television. That's all it was. They were running some TV spots for it, and I remembered it looked really interesting. And I talked my mom into taking me to see the film. I know she was slightly horrified when we saw it. She knew it was R-rated, but I don't think she expected it to be quite like what it was. I, in all honesty, as a kid, didn't expect it to be quite like what it was either. But, I love science fiction. I love robots. Cyborgs is always a fun thing. And this movie just looked really awesome. It looked really fun, and I just wanted to see it. But that's about the extent of it. I didn't see like a lot of print ads for it. I didn't remember seeing a lot of stuff in the comics. There was a lot of comics and stuff that came after that I read. I've read most of the RoboCop comics over the years. But for me, it was just a TV ad. It was just a really good trailer on a TV ad. And I talked my mom into it. I said, I want to see this. And we went and we saw it. I love this movie. I have loved this movie since this day. since that day, and I know my mom was always slightly horrified that she took me to see it. But that's it in a nutshell for me. That was my first experience. Tell me, Eric, how did you first hear about RoboCop?
Well, it's kind of similar to actually Back to the Future. I talked about that, how when Back to the Future came out, it was sort of a phenomenon, and I was hearing about it from everybody else. I did not see Back to the Future in the theater. And to this day, I'm not exactly sure why, because obviously that film I think was PG, so I'm not sure why we didn't go see it. We did go see, I distinctly remember seeing the sequels with my dad. I saw the sequels in the theater with my dad. But with RoboCop, obviously one of the issues for me was it's a rated R film, and I was not allowed to watch rated R films. So there was no way my mom was going to take me to this, or my dad was going to take me to this in the theater. That was just not going to happen. That was not in the realm of possibility. I was not allowed to watch rated R movies when this movie came out. But I had a friend who was, and he told me all about it. So I pretty much knew all about the movie before I ever saw it, kind of similar to Back to the Future where everybody's talking about it. This was one friend in particular. So he told me everything about it, all the infamous scenes, and I had all these visions in my head of what was happening. I also remember, I think I saw the review that Siskel and Ebert did. So I saw that. There was a lot of buzz about this movie because it was very controversial because originally it had a rated X rating. It was actually it wasn't going to have an R. The violence was so intense in the original cut that this film was supposed to be rated X. I don't think NC-17 even existed yet. So this was originally not even going to be a rated R movie. It was even higher than that. I remember seeing the news stories about that as a kid. So it intrigued me, of course, because it's like forbidden fruit. It's taboo. Ultimately, what happened is whenever this film came out on video, we were a member of Columbia House, or one of those services where you could order different, videos. And somehow I convinced my parents to order RoboCop for me. It's funny because a lot of the other stuff I ordered, that was when we were ordering all our Disney movies. Like I had Cinderella, Three Caballeros, all that kind of stuff. And then I somehow got them to go ahead and get RoboCop for me. And I'm not sure how that happened or why, because I'm sure they could see right there in the description that was rated R. So this was actually like the first rated R film that I had. So I had this as a VHS tape. It was one of my prized possessions because it was mine, and I didn't have a big collection of videotapes. We never had a big videotape collection growing up. And this was this is basically my first rated R movie, and I saw it on videotape.
Very interesting. So we do have some comments here from the Rogues Gallery. I kind of don't want to talk about them, but we're going to go ahead and bring them up. My mom, Jane Shinks, comments. She says, Dave begged me to take him to the theater to see this movie. I bought him a large popcorn after the scene of him being shot. We're talking about Murphy. Dave never touched his popcorn. I looked at him and said, no more X-rated movies. Then she follows up by saying this was the only one I ever took him to see. And you're correct, Mom, but I saw the other ones in the theater anyway, and I took myself. So, when I saw this first movie, I was.
You gotta go Bobby's comment. Bobby said I had a very similar experience after that opening scene. Says my jaw hit the floor.
Well, and the thing that's interesting is for this retro review, I was trying to watch it actually because it said it's available on all these different streaming services, but one of these cable networks has got the rights to this film tied up some sort of way. So I ended up just watching. I actually bought the director's restored, whatever the heck they're calling it, like the Blu-ray version of the film.
Is this the unrated version? Or is this the
yes,
R version?
It is. Yeah, it's the unrated. It's the
okay.
one. Yeah, it's the one that has the extended, more sort of tortured scene of Murphy being murdered. It has an animatronic head that looks really real. It's really messed up looking. That's the version I actually watched for this. RoboCop. I hadn't seen a lot of horror movies growing up. And RoboCop was my first real foray into like that kind of level of gore. I'd never really seen anything quite like that when I was, that age. And it's not like I have a fascination with gory movies. It's not like I have a fascination with horror movies. I don't. But the violence and everything that happens in this movie, it just makes sense within the framework of this world as it's created. I mean, it makes sense within the context of this story. So it never feels like unjustified, just like the satire. It all goes together, in order to bring this film together. And I think it's these combinations of elements that make this film so special. Without that horrific murder scene, you don't really feel the tragedy I don't think you'd feel the tragedy as strongly. And I think you can see that in further films in this series. By the time you get to Robocop 3, while there's things I like about Robocop 3, some of those elements, they don't play out as well because it just doesn't. You take too many of these elements out, and the film doesn't have the resonance or the power that this film has. I think it's those extremes that make this film work. But anyhow,
well, as James Jones says, I'd buy that for $1.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I remember I had this film and Dark Knight Returns. Those were two big pivotal touchstone moments for me. And it's weird because these things feel like they go together in a weird way. I could see RoboCop patrolling, Batman's future Gotham City from Dark Knight Returns. I could see them working the same mean streets essentially. No, yeah, it was. But this film, I just remember just being completely sucked into this world, and I've loved this movie ever since. And the incredible performances in this film, even as a kid, I remember just being blown away by Peter Weller. And it's weird because I eventually, as I got older, I searched out other Peter Weller films, and he's in some good movies, but I don't think any of them have the resonance that this film has, because there's just a power to his performance in this movie that works so incredibly well. And there's even small moments, like the first time that you see his eye when the Ed 209 is where Ronnie Cox's character, who's the Dick Jones, where he uses the Ed 209 against RoboCop. And there's that moment where you see the humanity, behind the helmet. This film is just so well put together. It's just really, really well put together as just a piece of storytelling. It's so incredibly well done. And all the moments are earned. That's the thing too. Like all the really great raw moments in this film, they're really earned, especially by the time you get to the end of the film and the old man, the head of OCP, says, "Nice shooting, son. What's your name?" And he turns and looks. He says, "Murphy." Every moment in this film is so incredibly well earned. But anyhow, like I said, it's one of my favorite films. So we've got a few more comments here in the Rogues Gallery, and then we should talk about how we feel about the film today. So Jane says, first movie that the sound of RoboCop walking made our chairs vibrate, so powerful. And that's an important part of this film. The soundtrack by Basil Polidorius is so great. That really makes me wish
I'd seen it in the theater, because I didn't get the opportunity to see it in the theater, because that is a very iconic moment in the movie. In fact, I remember I think a lot of the reviews used that scene in particular of when he's first sort of introduced. He first sort of walks into the police station. Yeah. So that's one thing I really wish I had seen that in the movie theater, because I've never had that experience of the chairs vibrating like that because of the soundtrack.
It was awesome.
It's just never going to happen for me, unfortunately. Matt from Pertronics, he says that the first one was the best, and I have to tend to agree with you, Matt. The first one definitely is the best. I don't think anybody would really dispute that. Probably someone out there will, but I don't think many people would.
And it's such a, and that's the thing. Everything about this film works, and it works so incredibly well. Whether you want to talk about the sound design, whether you want to talk about the score, because I love the score by Basil Palladorius in this film.
It's
the
an incredible score.
So good.
It's very
and then for those people who are not familiar, Basil Palladorius did the score for Conan, but he also did the score for Starship Troopers. I mean, he just an incredibly talented composer. But I think RoboCop for me goes up there with Conan as probably some of his best work. And it just the drama really helps to come through in the music, because there are times where the music is kind of goes along with Peter Weller's performance, and it helps you to feel and understand what RoboCop is going through, even though sometimes he's not really able to properly vocalize it.
Obviously, no, that's a great point, because obviously once he becomes RoboCop, once he's not really Alex Murphy anymore and he becomes RoboCop, he's very stoic. And also his face for much of the film is obviously obscured. You can only see the bottom of his mouth. But even that doesn't really matter, because even when he takes the helmet off, he doesn't get to emote very much because obviously he is a cyborg. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The music really helps kind of with that gap in terms of the ability of the actor to show emotion, because he's basically, I'm sure he was being told not to. You know what I mean? It's like, you're a cyborg. You know what I mean? So you can't be showing all this emotion on your face. But still, the performance is still subtle enough that you can see it. You can see it within the context of him being a cyborg and being very what's the word I'm looking for? Very, very emotionless. But he's able to still sort of emote in a sort of special way, and the music really helps with that. It really sets the scene and really helps you kind of see how he's feeling, because you're not going to see it on his face. You can't see it on his face. He's not able to show that. He's not able to do that. He doesn't cry or something like that. They didn't go there, which I think is good. They kept RoboCop as just this tough, he's a cyborg. He's part man, part machine. You know what I mean? So he's different now. He's not the same person that he once was, although he's trying to regain some of that, trying to get some of that humanity back. You talked about that earned statement at the end, because that's what that's all about. That's the whole point of the movie, right? Is this guy loses his humanity and then has to get it back, and that's basically the heart of it all, James kind of went back to something you talked about earlier. He said, it's funny you brought up Dark Knight Returns, because Miller worked on RoboCop 2 and 3, much to his regret. And I've heard those stories as well. That is an interesting parallel that you bring up there, James, because Dave was talking about the fact that the Dark Knight Returns seems to fit with this, and RoboCop could easily be patrolling the streets of Gotham, which is maybe what Miller was thinking. You know what I mean? Maybe he thought that himself. He's all like, hey, I see some parallels from my story. I think I could do something really cool with this.
Yeah.
Maybe you could, maybe you couldn't.
I do have something interesting that I want to bring up along those lines. But before we wrap up the review.
Just 1 second. Matt's saying bye. So thanks for coming in, Matt from Portronics Film Festival. He said, great show tonight, gentlemen. He says, I'll catch you all next time. So thanks, Matt, for tuning in and checking this out. I know Matt very well, so I know he's been watching on his phone, by the way. So I really appreciate you sticking it out this long and checking out the show.
Yes, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Well, here's the let's finish our retro review, and then I have this thing I want to bring up. So, of course, in order to be a retro review, we have to talk about how we feel about the film today, having recently rewatched it.
I didn't get to talk about how I felt about it back then.
Oh, okay. So, go ahead. Talk about how you felt about the film back in the day.
As I mentioned, I got this. This was like the first rated R movie that I basically owned. And it was one of the first movies that was like mine. Like I mentioned, I had a couple like Disney films and things like that were kind of mine. But this was like the first time that I had kind of definitely a rated R film that belonged to me. It was like my personal movie. And I watched it all the time. I had a very small collection of videos. I didn't even own Star Wars. I didn't own any of the Star Trek films, and those are the franchises that I really like the most. So I watched the heck out of this movie. It was just absolutely intriguing to me because I didn't get to watch a lot of gore or anything like that. I wasn't supposed to be watching rated R movies. Again, I still don't understand why my parents allowed me to have this and why I owned it, but I watched it like crazy. I'm pretty sure that VHS tape is completely worn out. So I was absolutely intrigued by it because, like I said, I didn't have any other real context for films with this kind of violence in them or anything like that. Nudity, I wasn't used to that. There's some very brief nudity in it, but it stuck out to me as a kid. You know what I mean? Because I didn't have anything else really to compare it to. So it really had a big impact, I guess, on my childhood because, like I said, I didn't really have anything else that I was exposed to that was like this. It wasn't until maybe a little bit later I had a friend who was really into horror movies. And I used to watch horror movies at his house, not at my house, but at his house, I get to watch them. So it did have a big impact on me in terms of that. And I watched it like crazy. Like I said, I was absolutely fascinated with it.
Well, very cool. So in order to be a retrospective, we have to talk about obviously how we first heard about the film, how we felt about it back then, and then actually how we feel about the film today, having recently rewatched it. So I watch this film pretty regularly. It's on a lot. One of the interesting things I like to talk about is Barney Wrightson, who's a tremendous illustrator, artist, comic artist, who has since left us. But one of the things I like to talk about is someone asked him because Bernie is actually also the co-creator of Swamp Thing with Len Wein, and Swamp Thing had two films at the time that this question was asked to him. We were at a it was a model and mostly a model building convention actually in Kentucky. I think it's WonderCon, I think is what they call it. Maybe I'm confusing it with something, or Wonderfest. Anyhow, it's primarily, this convention is geared towards people who build resin model kits, and some of them build ships, and some of them build anime, mech robots, and a lot of people are into just kind of sort of figurines, whether it's or model figure kits, whether it's Batman or Frankenstein, the Mummy, whoever, Dracula. So Bernie was a guest at this one show. I think it's Wonderfest. I know several years in a row he was a fan favorite, and one of the years I got to go, he put on a live demo where he was actually drawing Swamp Thing while the crowd watched, and everyone just sort of like asked him questions. One of the questions that was asked to him is because Bernie had seen so many of his characters at that point, and at that point, superhero characters in live action movies were still kind of rare. It's not like it is today. And so Swamp Thing was one of those characters that had been adapted as a cable television series. It had 2 big budget films. Well, not big budget, but it had 2 theatrically released films. This is a big deal. So someone asked him, they said what he felt like the best sort of comic book movie was out of the ones that had been made, wondering, I think, if he would actually say, one of his Swamp Thing films or whatever. And Bernie actually brought up Robocop as, at that time, being sort of the best sort of comic book inspired or comic book sort of kind of film, even though it wasn't a comic book, just when you look at the elements of it. And I could see why it appealed to me, and it still appeals to me in the same way. So I can't recommend, if you haven't seen the original Robocop, I can't recommend watching it enough. It's one of my favorite films of all time. Even having recently, revisited it, it's still such a great film. I really feel like it is a classic in my mind, especially for those of us that are into the sci-fi action adventure genre. Like I really feel like it's a classic. So that's my total take on it. So tell me, Eric, how do you feel about the film today?
Well, I've always enjoyed this film. I do own it, which I always mention. That's high praise if I own the film. I'm lucky that I owned it. As Dave was talking about earlier, one of the reasons we decided to review this was because it was supposed to be available on Hulu. Well, as he mentioned, you have to actually, I think, have the Stars package in order to actually see this on Hulu. And we didn't know that when we first decided to review this. So luckily, I do own this. It was actually a gift from someone years and years or years ago. The only unfortunate thing about this is it's not the unrated version. This is the R version. I think I've only seen the unrated version maybe once, if I've actually seen it. I don't know if I've actually seen the unrated version before, but that's what I always wanted. I always wanted the unrated version, but someone gave this to me, and I was like, well, I'm not going to buy the same movie twice. So I do own it, and thankfully, because I owned it, I was able to watch it. I actually watched it earlier today, and it is a great movie to rewatch. This movie is so prophetic. It is just amazing how many things in this movie are relevant to today. There's a joke I remember that they did on Honest Trailers where they talk about how basically this is modern day Detroit that is depicted in this film, you know? So they predicted that. The way they treat news, you know what I mean? And all the stuff where people talk about fake news and we lampoon the media, all over this film. Also, if people might not notice, these newscasts are only supposed to be 3 minutes. So they give you 3 minutes to basically figure out everything that's going on. They don't give any context. They just throw it all out there. And to me, that's very much the way that the internet works. And even though they didn't predict the internet, they did predict the way news works now. People just digest it in these little blurbs, and that's it. You know what I mean? And of course, you know, you can tell these guys are fake as can be. As far as the newscasters and stuff like that. So they predicted that. DVDs, Blu-rays, that's one of the big ones that I always think is cool because that was not common. You know, back in the late 80s, people were not saying that we were going to be watching videos essentially on DVDs or Blu-rays because clearly that's what they watch. You know, Clarence Boddicker has that moment where he puts in that video that Dick Jones made and before they kill the creator of Robocop. And it's clearly a DVD or a Blu-ray. They don't call it anything, but that's clearly what it is. Police officers are talking about going on strikes right now. That talk is going on. Never thought it would happen in my lifetime. I was, you know, involved in public safety for 20 years. But guess what? Police are now talking about going on strike. It might actually really happen in some cities. I mean, there's just so much in this that's incredibly prophetic, and not necessarily exactly in the way that they said, but in terms of the tone, in terms of kind of, you almost feel like what the writers were seeing back in that era. And they were like, hey, I could see this stuff happening. I could see this stuff happening in the future. You know, the concept of privatizing the police, that's something that's on the table right now. People are talking about that. There are so many things that are incredibly topical in this movie and incredibly relevant to what's going on today. So it's a really interesting movie to watch in that context. And I did want to mention that one of the other reasons we decided to review this was because on our previous episode, we reviewed The Terminator. And we thought that, you know, The Terminator and RoboCop, that's sort of a natural matchup. That's a natural contrast. And give a shout out because my brother pointed this out to me when I was a kid. And I remember this is something that's always stuck with me. There's that interesting, you know, we talked about in our last review of Terminator, how there's that scene where the Terminator walks into a police station and kills a ton of police officers. In RoboCop, he goes into a huge den of drug, you know, basically a drug manufacturing plant, and he just wipes everybody out, all the druggies, all the criminals. And I've always thought that that's interesting, that contrast between the two films. So there's just so many interesting things about this movie. I definitely think it's you know, it still has that huge impression on me that I did as a kid, and I'm seeing new things in it now, watching it today that I didn't really think about when I watched it originally.
So it is a hugely relevant film today. That's the thing. It's that's the thing that's always kind of surprising to me too, is that when we revisit some of these things and how some of the themes sometimes and how some of the concepts are still relevant and still worth discussing even today. So along those lines, real quick, we do have some comments over here in the Rogues Gallery, but I wanted to point this out, and then I don't. Well, we won't bother with showing my screen, but I'll just tell you. So on as a part of Amazon Prime, there is a short special that's available that you can watch for free on there, and it's called "The Hidden Meaning in RoboCop 2." And it's interesting because RoboCop 2 is the RoboCop film, besides the recent remake, that sometimes takes a lot of heat for not being as good. Now, I'm not a huge fan of RoboCop 2, but there's a lot of things about RoboCop 2 that I enjoy, just like there's a lot of things I actually enjoy about RoboCop 3. But this is really interesting. I actually watched this. It's about 9 minutes. Like I said, it's available to watch for free on Amazon Prime, but it's called The Hidden Meaning in RoboCop 2. And basically what the person who put that together basically puts forward is that what RoboCop 2, whether directly or indirectly, what it is it's a commentary on what happens when you take a great character like RoboCop and you try to make him a mass market franchise. And you try to sanitize him so kids and everyone can watch it in a more safe sort of, put together manner and make it more family friendly. And that RoboCop 2 is a weird sort of like, I don't know how to describe this other than to say that RoboCop 2 is sort of a weird examination of what happens when you do that and how you can basically destroy something. It's very, very interesting. And I recommend if you have Amazon Prime, you like RoboCop, you like RoboCop 2, and I'd never really thought about a lot of this until I watched this thing. But it's really pretty interesting. It's about 9 minutes, not very long. But all of a sudden it's got me wanting to revisit RoboCop 2 and look at it with a different mindset and a different sort of perspective to say, is RoboCop 2, it's not really saying so much about society, but what it is doing is it's taking a look at what happens when you take an R-rated film that really captures or is a touchstone moment that really hits and breaks through, and you try to repurpose it in order to turn it into a family-friendly franchise, and how destructive that is to what it was that people liked that made it a breakthrough or a breakout hit. It's really interesting.
See, what's funny about that is I always heard that criticism of RoboCop 3. That's what I always heard. Even when the film was coming out, everybody was saying that. I remember people talking about that before the film even came out when we realized it was going to be PG-13. Because RoboCop 2 is R. And RoboCop 2 does have a ton of violence and stuff like that. So I almost wonder, I haven't seen this. I almost have to wonder if that person is kind of merging the two and merging the two thoughts together, because I can see it. I can see what they're talking about, because obviously RoboCop is literally deconstructed. I mean, that's literally what happens to him. And I remember the directives. I always remember that. Like he had 300 directives or something. It was just like massively ridiculous. And he was going insane because of all the different directives, and it was screwing him up. He had to get rid of all of them in order to be sane again. So I can kind of see that, but I almost feel like maybe they're kind of merging those two concepts together.
Well, there's a difference between RoboCop 3 that's very much meant to be that versus RoboCop 2, which is still an R-rated film, but it seems to be trying to say something in a weird way that's not as relatable or relevant as what RoboCop 1 is trying to say. And it's interesting because what he says is at the end of the day, he's like, whether intentional or unintentional, RoboCop 2 has a lot to say about what happens when sort of the studio, quote unquote, decides to turn something into a franchise. And in a narrative form, through allegory, whatever, how it kind of shows what happens. It's really interesting. I can see what you're saying, Eric. And there, there is something to that. This piece is very much armchair quarterbacking, no matter whichever is or isn't true, or necessarily the case. But I just think it's interesting for people like those of us who just love RoboCop to look at, because it has me wanting to revisit RoboCop 2 with a different mindset in order to see what else maybe is there that maybe I might have missed, or I might have overlooked, or maybe I wouldn't have given any more importance or context to it than a superficial viewing, because there's some things about RoboCop 2 I like, but it's nowhere near as good as the first one. But when looked at through this particular lens, it makes me wonder, it's like, wow, was RoboCop 2 just really amazingly relevant just to RoboCop 1? Is it more a commentary on film and franchise than necessarily a commentary on society or people or the future, as what RoboCop 1 is? Because another theme of RoboCop 2 is this idea that as we become more one with technology, the more we lose our connections to people, and the more we lose our own humanity. And sometimes we can't even see it because we're almost being driven by what the machines are telling us to do. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about.
Actually, it's not the machines that are causing the problem in this in this franchise. It's the people that are causing the problems in this franchise. You know what I mean?
No, but you understand.
It's the board of OCP, and it's just the way society has become so corrupt. You know what I mean? In this series, I mean, I get what you're saying. I do understand that there's an element of that, but to compare it to, say, Terminator. In Terminator, that's clearly the theme of Terminator, is the idea that the machines take over. That's not exactly what's happening here. You know what I mean? In this case, it's the human beings that are screwing everything up. You know what I mean?
Right. The point I'm making is that sometimes when you allow machines maybe to, and again, just a general sense, I'm talking thematically, and because I can see it just in general, but it's just this idea that as we become more one with the machine, if we're not careful, whether it's the puppet master behind pulling the strings who controls the machine, right? Or it's just our loss of connection to people, family, whatever. I just think that there's something to be said there. That's even further. Right.
Definitely. The loss of connection to people is definitely a theme in this movie. That's definitely something that he loses. He even says it. He can't remember his family. He says I can feel them, but I can't remember them. You know what I mean? So there's obviously a clear disconnect to his prior relationships, and it's because of the process that he's undergone and all that stuff. But I did want to mention, because you were talking about before this idea of from that movie or whatever, that short, that they talk about the this is what happens when you take a sort of a good R-rated thing and you try to make it for kids. I actually really love the RoboCop cartoon series, and what's really neat about it is, in a lot of ways, it picks up right after RoboCop 1, and it doesn't deal with anything in RoboCop 2. In fact, I don't think RoboCop 2 had even come out yet when the RoboCop cartoon came out. A lot of people may not remember it. It was part of like the Marvel Showcase. So there was a couple other shows involved with that. It was like an hour-long thing, and they used to rerun some of the old Spider-Man cartoons and things like that along with it. But it's actually had some really interesting elements where they took things from the original movie and they expanded on it. For instance, Dr. McNamara. It's funny, a lot of people that probably love RoboCop may not even remember who that was. Dr. McNamara is the guy who's operating Ed 209 when they do the test. And Jane had mentioned, she said, I kept closing my eyes to not see the gore, but opened my eyes just in time to see the guy get hit with a car and exploded on the windshield. Well, that character, they actually brought him no, that was in the TV series. Now I'm doing it. I'm mixing different RoboCops together. But in the cartoon, McNamara was actually like a major character. He was actually like the major villain for RoboCop, because he was always trying to make he was still basically upset about Ed 209, and he had made more like Ed 220 and stuff like that, where he was competing with RoboCop. So they actually took a lot of elements from the movie that I thought were really interesting and fascinating, and they expanded on them in that cartoon show, and they never touched on any of that stuff in RoboCop 2 or RoboCop 3. One of the things I mentioned to Dave off the air that I remember about that show was they even had Lewis and Murphy as RoboCop go on a date, because there was obviously implications that there might be some sort of romance between them in the movies, but they never went there. But in the cartoon, they actually were dating and stuff like that, which I found really interesting watching that as a kid. So I think that's just ironic. I'm going to throw that out there because talking about that, because obviously the intention of the cartoon was absolutely to market to kids and all that stuff. But I thought the cartoon had some really cool elements that they never even touched on in the movies.
Well, and I mentioned too off the air off the air actually at the end of, we tend to talk a little bit and sort of discuss what we're going to do for the next show at the end of the previous show. And I had mentioned that the Joel Kinnaman, the new RoboCop film, that there's some interesting elements in it. Obviously it doesn't compare to the original, but there's one really great scene in the Joel Kinnaman film that I think makes that film actually worthwhile. And it's the scene where they're having a hard time kind of breaking him down enough in order to program him properly. And he keeps managing to be able to resist. And one of the ways that they finally manage to really break him down is they actually have this really powerful and it's gut-wrenching scene where they take all the mechanized parts away from him until it's basically just what's left of him as Murphy, a human being. They make a comment in this film that all you are, or maybe it's the second film, that all you are is so many a brain and so many pounds of flesh. You're not even a corpse. Well, they show us in that film what actually remains of Murphy, and Joel Kinnaman plays that scene so incredibly well. And that scene alone, I think, is worth watching that movie just to see that, because I feel like that's the one element that they could have done in a RoboCop 2 or whatever that would have really added to Murphy's story and really driven home the tragedy of what has happened to him and what he is now.
I will say this because we talked about that last week, because you were telling me, because I haven't seen that film and I have no intention of seeing that film. I'm a classic guy. I like the originals. I don't do a lot of the reboots and the remakes and stuff like that, and I keep getting burned on them. So that's what happened there. But I thought that idea was fascinating, but I realized that scene where he takes off his helmet, to me, in this film, does the same thing. There's that moment where he has that recognition and he does see what he's become. He understands. I mean, literally, the only flesh he can see is his face. Even the back of his head is replaced with mechanical components and stuff like that. And remember that the reaction that he has is he basically is like disgusted, and he even tells Lewis to just back off and leave him alone. You know what I mean? Because he just once he has that recognition of what he is, he needs a moment. He needs a moment to process it. So I think this film did the same thing in a very different way. Because I was thinking of that I was thinking of what you told me, and when I saw that scene, I was all like, well, they did deal with that. They did actually deal with that in the original film, because he has that moment where he does recognize what he's become and what's left of him, and it's not much. I mean, basically all that he's seeing is a face, and it's like half a face, because the back of his head even isn't flesh anymore.
Right. Yeah, but like I said, I feel like that moment would have been good for like a RoboCop 2, or RoboCop 3. I feel bad that, and I think it's unfortunate that moment isn't represented within one of the films that comes after that's kind of in the main trilogy. You know what I mean, for the original. It's such a powerful scene, and it's just that one element. I'm like, that would have been really interesting, you know what I mean, to have in one of these other films, to further kind of drive that point home. because the way that Peter Weller plays that, the recognition scene in this film is powerful and classic, and I would never want to take that away, and I would never want to change that. But I just think that particular moment put in another film would have been really amazing. You know what I mean? And help to buoy, those other films that I feel like are lacking some of that at times, So that was the only point I was trying to make. So, but anyhow, so like I said, I discovered this interesting little thing on Amazon Prime. I thought some people might enjoy checking out. Like I said, it caused me to think about RoboCop 2 in a different light. So that's always interesting. So I think we're both kind of in agreement. We think this is pretty much a classic. And if you haven't seen it, you should check out RoboCop. Would you agree, Eric?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. It's and like I said, it's surprisingly like a lot of stuff we've talked about. You find new things in it when you watch recently, and even in applying things that you're seeing in the world today. There's even like a throwaway line I think about where Dick Jones is doing the introduction and talking about OCP and the fact that they involve themselves in things like healthcare and space exploration, things that are traditionally nonprofit. Isn't that incredibly relevant today? We've got SpaceX, all sorts of debates about healthcare and stuff like that. And there was OCP leading the charge this entire time. You know what I mean? It's incredibly tough.
Well, good money is where you find it. So
right, good money is where you find it.
All right, cool. So do we think that's good? Are we good to go to the outro or?
Yeah, I did want to just mention, James, you talked, when I was talking about that scene with what I call the DVD or Blu-ray, you said, the days of Laserdisc. Well, that wasn't a Laserdisc. Laserdiscs were big honking things. That was like a CD that he threw in there. So I just want to kind of make that little clarification, James, with you, is that's what I think is one of the things that is incredibly prophetic about the movie, because it wasn't a Laserdisc. He was put that in with one hand. It was a little disc, just like a CD.
Very cool. So with that, are we good to go to the outro?
Yeah, I think we're good to go.
All right, cool. All right. So I want to thank you for hopefully watching or listening. It's time to redo it. So I want to thank you for hopefully watching or listening to this episode of the Retro Rogues Live. Again, my name is Dave Bate, and I've been one of your hosts. If you're curious to see some of my artwork or learn more about me, you can do that and so much more at my website, which also serves as the official website for the Retro Rogues, and that's at davebaty.com. That's www.davebaty.com. I want to thank Mr. Eric Alexander, co-host, for being on here and providing his unique perspective and opinion on things. Sometimes we see eye to eye, and sometimes we don't. That's part of what makes the show fun and interesting. Eric, please tell the folks, hopefully watch or listen at home, where they can learn more about you on the interwebs.
Well, I'm most active on Twitter, and you can find me at BaseGod14. That's at BASSGOD14. You can see that in the little corner of my screen right now. And I did want to go back to another comment that James said earlier in regards to Dave's comments about the Dark Knight Returns, and we're talking about Frank Miller, and he said, I think the studio thought that and cut him a Hollywood check. Might have been a factor, not for sure, but maybe. That and empty promises. And with that, we will leave our viewers with the last word.